Picture this: Baghdad, 1095. At the height of his glory, at just 37 years old, the most influential theologian in the Islamic world suddenly loses his ability to speak in front of hundreds of students. Al-Ghazali, the brilliant professor at Nizamiya University, a master of logic and philosophy, stands before his audience and cannot utter a single word. His mind is paralyzed not by illness, but by a question that demolishes the very foundations of knowledge. How can we even know what is real? This crisis would become the starting point of one of the most dramatic intellectual journeys in human history. Al-Ghazali would renounce prestige, wealth, and career in pursuit of absolute truth. He would question perception, logic, and authorities, everything upon which human knowledge is built. His doubts would become so profound that 500 years before Descartes, he would formulate a method of radical skepticism that would revolutionize Islamic philosophy and influence Western thought. But unlike many skeptics, Al-Ghazali wouldn't stop at destruction. He would find a path to a new, unshakable certainty that would unite reason, mystical experience, and revelation into a unified system of knowledge. So, dear friends, are you ready to dive into the most complete explanation of Al-Ghazali's philosophy? Then, get comfortable. And before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to this channel. Part 1. The Architecture of Doubt. Al-Ghazali's path from intellectual triumph to spiritual crisis reads with the intensity of a psychological drama. Picture the scene. The year is 1095, and Al-Ghazali stands at the height of his influence. At only 37, he holds the most revered scholarly position in the Islamic world, head professor at Baghdad's famed Nizamiya University. More than 300 students regularly attend his lectures, hanging on his every word. He is a master of Islamic jurisprudence, theology, philosophy, and logic, attracting aspiring scholars from across the Islamic realm to learn under his guidance. Yet, beneath this image of academic brilliance, a storm was silently gathering. In his later autobiographical work, Deliverance from Error, Al-Ghazali would reveal that his turmoil was not about isolated ideas, but rather a deep and terrifying doubt that reached into the very foundations of knowledge itself. This wasn't mere intellectual curiosity or philosophical sport. It was a soul-shaking crisis that brought his entire understanding of truth into question. It was triggered by a question that seemed simple, yet carried profound implications. How can we truly know that what we believe is real? Al-Ghazali came to a disquieting realization. Most human beliefs are not conclusions reached through independent reasoning, but are absorbed from authority figures. Children trust their parents, students follow their teachers, and believers adhere to their religious leaders. But what if those sources of knowledge are themselves fallible? What if entire intellectual systems are constructed on unverified and possibly incorrect assumptions? This unsettling thought led Al-Ghazali to investigate the trustworthiness of sensory perception. We generally accept our senses as reliable tools for interpreting the world. We see the sun rise in the east and set in the west and assume it revolves around us. We touch water and feel its wetness, concluding that wetness is a property of the liquid itself. But Al-Ghazali was keenly aware of how easily our senses can deceive us. A distant object seems small despite its size. A straight stick looks bent in water, and dreams can feel completely real while we're in them. If our senses can be so misleading in the material realm, how much less dependable might they be in matters of deeper metaphysical significance, such as the nature of reality, the divine, or the moral path? What if the world we perceive is nothing more than an elaborate illusion, a kind of dream disguising itself as truth? Yet his doubt did not stop at sensory perception. Al-Ghazali turned his scrutiny toward reason itself, questioning whether logic could truly serve as a gateway to certainty. The scholars of his era, much like those in modern times, held logic and mathematics in high regard as reliable guides to knowledge. Mathematical truths seemed unassailable. 2 plus 2 equals 4. The interior angles of a triangle always total 180 degrees, and the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line. These axioms appeared self-evident and unshakable. But even in these seemingly secure domains, Al-Ghazali found reason to doubt. How could we be absolutely sure that logical principles reflect the actual structure of reality? Consider the law of non-contradiction, which states that something cannot both exist and not exist simultaneously. Could this not simply be a constraint of the human mind, rather than a fundamental truth of existence? Might there not be realms of being that defy human logic, truths that transcend rational categories, where even the most precise reasoning fails to penetrate the mystery of the universe? This philosophical upheaval took a severe toll on both his body and mind. Al-Ghazali writes that his doubts became so overwhelming that he could no longer function in his academic role. Subjects he once taught with ease now seemed beyond his grasp. Faced with his students, he would try to speak, but no words would come, his voice silenced by the weight of his uncertainty. The intellectual framework he had built his life upon had crumbled, leaving him paralyzed by inner conflict. What sets Al-Ghazali's journey apart is not merely the depth of his skepticism or the anguish it caused, but the extraordinary rigor with which he confronted it. His crisis was not chaotic or irrational. It was methodical, relentless, and precise. He did not treat doubt lightly or indulge in it superficially. Rather, he developed a systematic and intentional approach to questioning, one that would leave a lasting impact on both Islamic and Western traditions of skeptical philosophy. He carefully differentiated various kinds of knowledge and subjected each to a thorough and exacting analysis. By critically examining the structure of arguments, assessing the reliability of different sources, and revealing the hidden premises that often support even our most basic convictions, he laid the groundwork for a new depth of inquiry. Yet this relentless skepticism was never his final destination. It was a disciplined means to an end, a way to test which beliefs could withstand the harshest scrutiny. Al-Ghazali's ultimate objective was to discover a form of knowledge so solid, so unshakable, that no honest doubt could undermine it. He aimed to rebuild his understanding of reality, truth, and moral guidance upon a foundation that was absolutely secure. The breakthrough did not come through analytical reasoning or syllogistic proof. Instead, he experienced what he described as a divine enlightenment, a light bestowed upon his heart by God. This was not a rejection of rationality, but a recognition of a deeper, more fundamental source upon which reason itself depends. He came to realize that rational thought rests upon assumptions that cannot be validated by reason alone. The capacity to reflect, to analyze, and to distinguish truth from falsehood all presume the existence of a conscious subject and the accessibility of truth. However, this foundational certainty was not merely intellectual. It was accompanied by a vivid and direct awareness of the divine, a lived encounter with the ultimate reality that underlies all existence. Al-Ghazali came to see that the most vital truths are not uncovered through logic in isolation, but through a transformation that engages the whole person, mind, heart, and spirit together. This realization became the bedrock of his later intellectual and spiritual outlook. It provided him with a method for evaluating competing systems of thought, a synthesis of logical rigor and mystical insight, and a conception of human purpose that surpassed the confines of intellectual achievement and worldly gain. What might have fractured his intellectual life instead became the fertile ground from which a profound and expansive vision emerged. Al-Ghazali's approach to skepticism stood in stark contrast to that of many modern philosophers. While contemporary skeptics often use doubt as a means of avoiding commitment or belief, Al-Ghazali employed it as a tool to uncover convictions worthy of absolute trust. For him, doubt was not a force of destruction, but of renewal, a necessary process for stripping away illusion and opening the soul to genuine understanding. He viewed both uncertainty and assurance not as fixed endpoints, but as milestones on the soul's path toward ultimate truth. His treatment of skepticism left a profound legacy, influencing far more than his own theological or philosophical conclusions. His inquiries compelled Muslim thinkers to grapple more deeply with the interplay between reason and revelation, prompting a richer discourse on their harmony. His influence reached beyond the Islamic world, resonating with Jewish and Christian scholars in medieval Europe, who encountered his ideas through Latin translations and were moved to refine their own explorations of faith and reason. Even René Descartes, though likely unfamiliar with Al-Ghazali's writings, adopted a method of radical doubt that closely mirrors his. What distinguishes Al-Ghazali's skepticism is the authenticity of its origins. His questions did not stem from idle curiosity or a desire to demonstrate intellectual skill. They arose from a sincere struggle with existential issues, questions about how to live, what to believe, and what ultimately gives life meaning. Thus, his skepticism was not merely an intellectual exercise, but a deeply personal and existential endeavor. It reached into the core of human experience, endowing his philosophy with a gravity and depth that abstract reasoning alone often lacks. This union of rigorous analysis and heartfelt searching is what continues to give his thought its lasting resonance, a philosophy sharpened by intellect and deepened by the honest pursuit of truth. He understood that unresolved doubt could lead not only to moral paralysis, but also to a deep sense of spiritual desolation. When certainty is unattainable, how can we be sure of the right way to live? And if every conviction seems equally uncertain, what prevents us from descending into nihilism or embracing the idea that all truths are purely subjective? Al-Ghazali addressed these profound concerns by asserting that genuine skepticism, when undertaken with total honesty and courage, can ultimately guide the seeker beyond the confines of doubt. It paves the way to a form of knowledge that transcends the limits of reason. The divine enlightenment he experienced did not reject rational inquiry. Instead, it represented its highest expression, reached only when reason is pushed to its outermost limits. At that boundary, the intellect becomes receptive to a deeper kind of awareness, one that includes rational thought, but also extends beyond it. This insight became foundational to Al-Ghazali's mature philosophy. He showed that reason and divine revelation, critical thinking and mystical experience, personal uncertainty, and inherited tradition are not necessarily in conflict. Rather, they can complement and deepen one another in the search for truth. His skepticism was not a force of destruction against knowledge, but a method for stripping away illusions and dismantling intellectual pride. In doing so, it created space for humility and receptiveness, qualities he saw as essential to discovering the ultimate nature of reality. Part 2. Navigating the Four Pathways. Following his harrowing crisis of doubt and the subsequent restoration of inner certainty, Al-Ghazali set out on one of the most exhaustive and intellectually demanding quests for truth ever attempted by a medieval thinker. He discerned four principal methods through which humans strive to attain knowledge and resolved to immerse himself fully in each one before rendering any judgment on its validity or limitations. His pursuit was far from the detached analysis of a disinterested scholar. It was the impassioned and urgent journey of a man whose emotional and spiritual survival hinged on discovering answers to the deepest questions of human existence. The first intellectual route he explored was that of the Mutakallimun, Islamic theologians who utilized logical reasoning to uphold religious beliefs against both external philosophical critiques and internal doctrinal disagreements. Al-Ghazali had received formal training in this discipline and was deeply familiar with its intellectual tools. Theologians had developed sophisticated methods of argumentation to support belief in God, affirm the possibility of miracles, and defend the coherence of divine revelation. Their reasoning had the power to disarm skeptics and offer rational reassurance to believers caught in the throes of uncertainty. Yet, as Al-Ghazali delved further into theological argumentation, he began to perceive its inherent constraints. While these scholars built strong, rational frameworks, they often started from unexamined premises rooted in religious tradition. This raised a crucial concern. What if the very foundations upon which their arguments rested were themselves open to question? Moreover, theological discourse tended to remain theoretical and abstract, rarely extending into the realm of personal spiritual experience. Such arguments might affirm the existence of God conceptually, but they fell short of enabling a direct, transformative encounter with the divine. For Al-Ghazali, theology, despite its intellectual strength, seemed primarily defensive in nature, more concerned with preserving accepted beliefs than unveiling deeper spiritual truths. While it could shield faith from rational attack, it lacked the ability to awaken the kind of life-altering insight that reorients one's entire perception of reality. Theological knowledge remained cerebral, something to understand and assent to, rather than an experiential truth to be lived and felt. Seeking a more penetrating path, Al-Ghazali next turned his attention to the intricate and ambitious domain of Islamic philosophy. This second path was heavily influenced by the Aristotelian tradition, particularly as it had been interpreted and expanded upon by eminent thinkers such as Al-Farabi and Avicenna. In characteristic fashion, Al-Ghazali approached philosophy with rigorous determination. He not only studied the conclusions of the philosophers, but also mastered their logical methodologies and metaphysical assumptions. His fluency in their system was so thorough that his book, The Aims of the Philosophers, was mistaken by some Western readers as a sincere endorsement rather than a strategic precursor to critique. What Al-Ghazali found most compelling about the philosophers was their unwavering commitment to rational demonstration and their insistence that only propositions supported by clear logical proof should be accepted. In fields like mathematics, natural science, and formal logic, their approach had yielded impressive and undeniable advancements, often in defiance of prevailing norms or religious traditions. Philosophers had formulated remarkably accurate models of planetary motion, advanced medical understanding through empirical observation, and refined the rules of logical reasoning. However, Al-Ghazali noticed a critical flaw. When philosophers ventured into metaphysical territory, exploring ultimate questions about existence, the divine, and the soul, they carried over their confidence from the empirical sciences without adequate justification. They often claimed the same level of certainty for metaphysical theories as they did for demonstrable facts in mathematics or astronomy. Yet, on closer inspection, their assertions about the eternity of the world, the nature of God's knowledge, and the fate of the soul rested on assumptions that could not be conclusively proven. The wide-ranging disagreements between philosophical schools further exposed the limitations of reason when applied to these ultimate concerns. Even more troubling for Al-Ghazali was the philosopher's tendency to elevate human reasoning above revealed knowledge. When philosophical conclusions conflicted with the explicit teachings of revelation, philosophers frequently reinterpreted Scripture to suit their theoretical constructs, seldom considering whether divine revelation might surpass the reach of human intellect. To Al-Ghazali, this over-reliance on reason was not only a philosophical error, but also a spiritual danger. The third path Al-Ghazali investigated was the cryptic and esoteric doctrine of the Ismaili sect, which maintained that genuine knowledge was accessible only to a select few, those who had received secret insights from infallible, divinely appointed leaders. The Ismailis claimed to provide a remedy for both intellectual doubt and spiritual confusion. According to them, the ultimate answers to life's deepest mysteries were hidden truths, inaccessible through reason alone, but revealed through special spiritual authority. This proposition deeply appealed to Al-Ghazali's desire for absolute certainty, compelling him to examine their teachings with the same analytical rigor he had applied to theology and philosophy. Yet, his examination uncovered a system built not on solid argumentation, but on circular reasoning and unsubstantiated assertions. Their claim to truth rested entirely on their supposed possession of concealed, privileged knowledge. However, when asked to substantiate this claim, their response merely reiterated their original assertion of authority. Much of their doctrine conflicted with observable facts, and their leaders lacked the profound insight and spiritual depth one might expect from genuinely enlightened guides. Al-Ghazali eventually came to see Ismailism as an intricate intellectual mirage, an ideology exploiting the human craving for certainty, yet failing to provide any genuine or coherent answers. Having exhausted this path, he turned next to Sufism, the mystical dimension of Islam, which promised not theoretical knowledge about the divine, but direct, lived experience of it. At first, Al-Ghazali approached Sufism with the same critical scrutiny he had applied to all previous disciplines. He delved into Sufi literature and conversed extensively with its practitioners to grasp their teachings and methods. It soon became apparent, however, that the essence of Sufism could not be fully captured through analytical inquiry alone. The Sufis insisted that their insights did not emerge from intellectual theorizing, but from personal spiritual experience, cultivated through rigorous practices of meditation, prayer, ethical discipline, and complete submission to the will of God. This form of knowledge, they argued, was not abstract or impersonal, but embodied and transformative. To understand it without undergoing the inner journey was, in their view, as fruitless as attempting to know the taste of honey without ever having tasted sweetness. This insight placed Al-Ghazali in a profound internal dilemma. His method relied on detached, objective analysis, but the Sufi path demanded active, personal participation for its truths to be revealed. How could he evaluate the validity of mystical experience while remaining an outsider to it? To resolve this conflict, Al-Ghazali made a radical and unprecedented choice. He recognized that genuine understanding of Sufism required more than observation. It demanded inner transformation. In a moment of bold resolve, he decided to become a practitioner himself. In November 1095, at the peak of his scholarly career, he renounced his prestigious academic post, distributed his wealth, and embraced the demanding path of Sufi practice. This decision was not a retreat from intellectual rigor, but rather an expression of his uncompromising commitment to truth. He was willing to surrender privilege, comfort, and reputation in pursuit of a deeper, more authentic understanding. Through this profound shift from rational philosopher to spiritual seeker, Al-Ghazali discovered insights that revolutionized not only his view of Sufism, but his entire conception of knowledge and existence. He found that the Sufi path offered a certainty that transcended the limits of philosophical reasoning, theological speculation, and secretive doctrines. Rather than discarding reason, this mystical knowledge provided a deeper grounding for it, clarifying its true purpose. The divine illumination he experienced did not negate the role of critical thought, but instead revealed its ultimate function, to guide the soul toward truth that satisfies not just the mind, but the whole of human being. Part 3. The Grand Synthesis. Al-Ghazali's crowning literary and intellectual achievement, the revival of the religious sciences, emerged from his exhaustive search for the true path to knowledge. Spanning 40 volumes, this monumental work is one of the greatest intellectual endeavors in human civilization. Structured in 4 major parts, each containing 10 books, the work explores every essential aspect of an integrated and meaningful spiritual life. To call it a manual for religious observance, however, would be to gravely understate its profound significance, much like referring to Beethoven's Ninth Symphony as a mere melody would fail to capture its sublime grandeur. Al-Ghazali offers far more than religious instruction. He presents a detailed architecture for inner transformation. In his vision, even the most routine elements of daily life become sacred opportunities for spiritual elevation and a direct engagement with ultimate truth. The vast scope and insight embedded in this opus reflect Al-Ghazali's fundamental conviction. True spiritual evolution cannot exist in isolation from the tangible world. He firmly rejected the notion that only reclusive ascetics could reach spiritual heights. Instead, he affirmed that the path to spiritual excellence lies open to those fully engaged in the everyday realities of family, work, and social life. What Al-Ghazali outlines is not only a feasible integration of the spiritual and the worldly, it is a necessary one for full human flourishing. In the first quarter of the revival, focused on devotional acts, he reveals the deeper psychological and spiritual wisdom hidden within traditional rituals. Take, for instance, the ritual prayer, a practice so common it risks becoming automatic. Al-Ghazali dissects its form to reveal an intricate design, where every movement and phrase works to shape the inner life, purifying the heart and orienting the soul toward the divine. The bodily gestures involved in prayer are not arbitrary. They instill humility and reverence. The spoken words of Scripture imprint divine consciousness onto the mind. The regular timing of the prayers throughout the day creates a spiritual rhythm that keeps the heart awake and mindful, shielding it from heedlessness and spiritual numbness. Yet Al-Ghazali goes far beyond outward observance. He uncovers the inward dimensions of prayer, explaining how a sincere practitioner can use the act to transcend ego and enter a state of divine presence. For him, prayer is not merely a duty, it is a vehicle for awakening, capable of leading one into intimate experience with the sacred. Still, he never loses sight of prayer's practical advantages. It disciplines daily life, fosters inner order, and deepens one's connection to a community of faith. His discussion of charity reflects this same holistic integration. Al-Ghazali shows how financial generosity acts as a powerful antidote to the soul's attachment to wealth. He analyzes the psychology of greed and demonstrates how consistent giving weakens the illusion that happiness or safety can be found in material accumulation. Far from offering abstract theory, he provides specific, actionable guidance: how much to give, whom to give it to, and the mindset required to give meaningfully. Throughout the text, Al-Ghazali masterfully fuses mystical aspiration with practical wisdom. The second section of the revival, which deals with social customs and everyday behavior, reinforces his conviction that spiritual advancement must permeate every aspect of human activity. His scope ranges from table manners to sexual ethics, from honest business practices to one's moral obligations to neighbors. This is not rigid legalism nor pedantic moralizing. Rather, it springs from his belief that every human action carries ethical significance. In the constant inner struggle between virtue and vice, no act is without consequence. His treatment of marriage captures this ethos in full. He portrays marriage not merely as a legal or social arrangement, but as a rich, multi-layered reality encompassing emotional intimacy, biological cooperation, spiritual growth, and societal responsibility. Sexual union, when pursued with conscious intention, becomes a form of worship. Parenting becomes a channel for developing unconditional love. The routine difficulties of domestic life, its disappointments and demands, are reimagined as spiritual exercises in patience, mercy, and compassion. Alongside these lofty ideals, Al-Ghazali gives precise and realistic advice: how to choose a spouse wisely, manage shared finances, and resolve marital conflict constructively. The third portion of the revival, which examines the inner vices that obstruct spiritual growth, may be Al-Ghazali's most psychologically sophisticated contribution. He investigates the deep-rooted spiritual afflictions that obscure the heart, preventing it from mirroring the divine light in its original clarity. Rather than adopting a tone of moral condemnation or indulging in abstract philosophical speculation, his approach is firmly anchored in a careful psychological analysis of these internal disorders, examining their origins, how they interact and reinforce each other, and the gradual process by which they can be remedied. Consider his examination of pride. He identifies it as one of the most perilous spiritual conditions, primarily because it undermines the very capacity for discernment that is essential for a sincere pursuit of truth. Once pride takes hold, it clouds self-awareness and renders a person unreceptive to correction, effectively freezing their spiritual development. Al-Ghazali probes the many subtle forms that pride can assume, how it can cloak itself in the guise of virtue, how intellectual skill may inadvertently foster spiritual arrogance, and how even religious accomplishments can feed the ego rather than refine it. Still, his goal is not to instill despair. Instead, he provides tangible methods and inner practices designed to loosen pride's hold on the soul. He describes how consistent self-examination can uncover the ego's illusions, how humble service to others can counteract self-centeredness, and how meditating on mortality can place worldly success into a humbling, eternal context. In the final section of his work, dedicated to the qualities that lead to spiritual salvation, Al-Ghazali offers an inspiring and realistic vision of the soul's capacity for renewal. Here, he delves into the elevated spiritual states that become accessible once the heart is freed from its inner corruptions and opened to divine influence. Even at this advanced stage, his teachings remain both grounded and deeply insightful. He illustrates that virtues such as patience, gratitude, reliance on God, and love for the divine are not distant ideals, but lived realities that can be cultivated through intentional practice and steadfast discipline. His treatment of repentance exemplifies this integration of inward transformation with concrete action. At a basic level, repentance involves recognizing one's wrongdoing, feeling genuine remorse, asking for forgiveness, and making a firm resolve to avoid repeating those faults. But Al-Ghazali makes it clear that authentic repentance reaches far beyond this outer form. At its most profound, repentance represents a total reorientation of the heart, from dependence on personal willpower to complete trust in divine mercy. It becomes not just sorrow for specific transgressions, but a deeper realization of the self's inadequacy when disconnected from divine grace. This insight marks the gateway into the more advanced stages of spiritual awareness. At these heights, the individual's will becomes harmonized with the will of God, and the boundaries of personal consciousness begin to dissolve into a direct experience of ultimate truth. Yet Al-Ghazali is careful to emphasize that such mystical attainments do not imply withdrawal from worldly obligations. On the contrary, he asserts that genuine spiritual knowledge enhances one's ability to engage with the world. Those who attain direct awareness of the divine are not called away from responsibility, but are instead empowered to serve others with greater compassion, clarity, and commitment. They embody a deepened sense of purpose and moral strength, fulfilling their roles in society not in spite of their spiritual insights, but because of them. Part 4. Revealing the Inconsistencies. In the pivotal year of 1095, Al-Ghazali made a momentous decision to step away from a distinguished academic career. That same year, he completed a groundbreaking work that would forever alter the trajectory of Islamic philosophy and influence generations of thinkers: The Incoherence of the Philosophers. This forceful critique of Aristotelian metaphysics challenged centuries of philosophical tradition and remains a central text in philosophical discourse even today. Though immensely influential, the incoherence is frequently misunderstood. It is often wrongly interpreted as a wholesale rejection of rational inquiry and philosophical thought. In truth, Al-Ghazali's intention was far more nuanced. His critique was precise and intentional, aimed at particular claims he found to be logically flawed and spiritually misleading. To appreciate the depth of his argument, one must situate it within the broader intellectual climate of his era. At that time, Islamic scholarship was deeply shaped by philosophers who had adopted and expanded upon Aristotle's ideas. Thinkers like Al-Farabi and Avicenna constructed elaborate philosophical systems, which they claimed offered rational demonstrations of key truths about God, the universe, and the soul's destiny. These philosophical doctrines gained considerable traction among the scholarly elite, and even influenced many theologians who might otherwise have been skeptical of reason's authority in matters of faith. Al-Ghazali's genius lay in his approach. He did not dismiss philosophy altogether, but used its own tools to reveal its contradictions and internal weaknesses. Rather than attacking logic itself, he held the philosophers accountable to their own rational methods, uncovering how often they strayed from them. He argued that many of their boldest metaphysical assertions lacked solid proof and were instead built upon unverified premises. When closely analyzed, their arguments showed logical inconsistencies that would have been immediately obvious in more concrete domains of thought. The Incoherence methodically dissects 20 core philosophical doctrines, each subjected to rigorous scrutiny. Among these, 3 doctrines stood out as not only erroneous, but dangerously subversive, so severe, in fact, that Al-Ghazali claimed adherence to them placed one outside the bounds of true belief. In his view, these positions directly undermined the essential tenets of theistic faith and could not be reconciled with a sincere commitment to divine revelation. The first of these controversial doctrines concerned the eternity of the universe. Philosophers argued that the cosmos had no temporal beginning and existed eternally as a necessary outflow of the divine essence. According to their view, the universe neither began nor will end. It simply is and always has been. Although couched in complex reasoning, Al-Ghazali saw this claim as fundamentally at odds with the scriptural understanding of divine creation. It reduced God to an impersonal source, rather than portraying him as the deliberate and sovereign creator. If the world has eternally existed, then God's will is irrelevant to its origin. There is no divine choice involved, no intentional act of creation, thereby eliminating the possibility of a personal relationship between Creator and creation. In countering this doctrine, Al-Ghazali drew deeply from both theological insight and philosophical critique. He demonstrated that the philosopher's reasoning hinged on questionable assumptions about divine immutability and perfection. Their argument rested on the premise that any act of will, such as creating the world at a particular point in time, would imply a change in God, and that such change would be a sign of imperfection. A truly perfect being, they argued, must be entirely unchanging, and therefore incapable of engaging in temporal acts like creation. Al-Ghazali challenged this line of thought by distinguishing between different kinds of change. Change brought about by necessity or external causes, he agreed, suggests imperfection. But a free and purposeful act initiated by divine will does not. The decision to create the world in time, far from indicating deficiency, actually demonstrates intentionality, sovereignty, and wisdom on God's part. The second condemned doctrine revolved around the scope of divine knowledge. The philosophers maintained that God knows only eternal universals, timeless and unchanging truths, but not the specific fleeting events that occur within time. By their account, God is aware of general principles governing the world, but does not know, for example, whether a particular bird falls from a particular tree at a specific moment. This claim arose from the philosophical difficulty of conceiving how an eternal and immutable being could be aware of temporal and changing particulars without himself being subject to change. While Al-Ghazali recognized the intellectual sophistication of this position, he argued that it came at an unacceptable cost. If God lacks knowledge of particular events, then the very notion of divine providence collapses. What meaning does prayer hold if God is unaware of individual actions? How can morality be sustained if divine judgment lacks the knowledge to reward or punish according to one's deeds? By denying God's awareness of specific occurrences, the philosophers inadvertently severed the crucial connection between the divine and human realms. They made genuine faith, prayer, and moral accountability meaningless, stripping religion of its deeply personal and relational dimensions. Al-Ghazali contends that the philosophical debate surrounding God's immutability is rooted in a misguided concept of perfection, particularly when applied to divine knowledge. He believes that philosophers have fundamentally misunderstood what constitutes true perfection in this context. One of the major theological missteps Al-Ghazali identifies is the denial of the resurrection of the body. According to the philosophers, only the rational soul endures after death, while the physical form dissolves irreversibly into its basic elements. They interpreted the Qur'an's vivid portrayals of bodily resurrection, along with the delights of paradise and the agonies of hell, as metaphorical rather than literal. In their view, these descriptions represented internal, spiritual realities rather than actual physical events in the afterlife. Al-Ghazali finds such interpretations both philosophically flawed and dangerous to theological doctrine. From a rational perspective, the claim implies that the soul's link to the body is purely incidental, suggesting personal identity can persist without any form of physical embodiment. However, self-consciousness in human beings is closely bound to corporeal experience, and it is not self-evident how identity could be preserved without it. From a religious standpoint, denying bodily resurrection weakens the theological framework of divine justice. It severs the connection between moral behavior and its ultimate consequences, thereby undermining the eschatological basis for reward and punishment. If physical resurrection is rejected, the moral weight of human actions in this life becomes diminished in the context of the hereafter. Al-Ghazali's critique, however, goes beyond these specific theological positions. He challenges the broader philosophical method used by these thinkers. He argues that they treat metaphysical propositions with the same level of certainty typically reserved for disciplines like mathematics or formal logic. Yet, metaphysical reasoning lacks the strict methodological rigor that justifies such confidence. In mathematics, conclusions are universally accepted because they derive from unambiguous axioms and follow precise logical steps. In contrast, metaphysical inquiry often leads to varied and conflicting conclusions across philosophical schools, revealing the absence of a consistent and dependable methodology for uncovering ultimate truths about existence. This recognition leads Al-Ghazali to a profound meditation on the limitations of human intellect in the search for final truths. He does not entirely reject philosophical investigation into metaphysical questions, but insists that reason must remain conscious of its inherent limits. The deepest insights, those concerning God, the cosmos, and the ultimate meaning of life, cannot be grasped through rational analysis alone. These truths demand a different kind of knowledge, one that arises through spiritual refinement and inner transformation. One of Al-Ghazali's most significant philosophical interventions is his challenge to the notion of causality. The philosophers maintain that cause and effect are necessarily connected, meaning that identical causes invariably lead to identical effects. This belief underpinned their conception of a coherent and intelligible universe, governed by reliable natural laws. But Al-Ghazali exposes a critical weakness in this line of reasoning. He points out that the supposed necessity between causes and effects is never directly observed. What we actually witness is a habitual sequence of events. For example, fire touching cotton and the cotton burning. From this repetition, we infer a necessary link. Yet this sense of necessity is not something we observe. It is an assumption our minds project onto the sequence of events. Because the notions of cause and effect can be conceptually separated, it is logically possible to imagine one occurring without the other. This implies that their connection is not intrinsically necessary, but merely contingent on God's will. Building on this insight, Al-Ghazali formulates a view later termed occasionalism. He asserts that God is the sole, genuine cause behind everything that happens in the natural world. What we perceive as interactions between created things are actually manifestations of God's ongoing and habitual creation of events. These consistent patterns produce the illusion of natural causality, while in truth they are expressions of divine volition. This framework allows for the predictability required by scientific inquiry, while simultaneously affirming God's absolute freedom. Although God generally brings events into being through stable and regular sequences, He remains entirely free to deviate from these patterns in accordance with His wisdom, thereby making space for miracles within the context of a structured and orderly cosmos. Part 5. The Radiance of Enlightenment. In the final stages of his intellectual and spiritual development, Al-Ghazali produced a masterful treatise that exemplifies the full maturity of his philosophical and mystical synthesis. The Niche of Lights. Written in the later period of his life, after years devoted to intense study and spiritual discipline, this work encapsulates his integrated vision of reality and knowledge. Within its pages, Al-Ghazali explores the intricate link between human consciousness and the ultimate nature of being. Taking as his point of departure the renowned Quranic verse of light, he expands its symbolic depth into a sophisticated epistemological model. By doing so, he brings together rational thought, mystical perception, and divine revelation into a cohesive understanding of how truth is apprehended. Light becomes the central metaphor in this framework, serving simultaneously as symbol, principle, and guide across multiple levels of interpretation. On its most accessible level, the metaphor of light signifies awareness, the faculty that makes understanding possible. Just as physical light enables the eye to perceive the material world, spiritual light illuminates the inner landscape of the mind, allowing the intellect to perceive higher truths. Yet, this metaphor extends far beyond mere analogy. For Al-Ghazali, light serves as the fundamental key to a layered vision of cosmology and knowledge. He proposes a graded structure of reality, where each level correlates with a particular mode of knowing, each requiring its own unique form of illumination. The lowest level encompasses the physical realm, the world of matter, sensory experience, and observable phenomena. This domain is the subject of empirical investigation, guided by the methods of science and logical reasoning. Here, the intellect operates as a light that uncovers patterns, causal relationships, and mathematical order. While Al-Ghazali values this level of understanding for its role in navigating material existence, he insists that it falls short when it comes to perceiving ultimate reality. According to him, the physical world represents only a partial and derivative expression of a deeper reality, a kind of echo or projection of more fundamental truths. Those who regard the material as the final reality, without probing deeper, remain trapped in a state of illusion. He likens this to Plato's allegory of the cave, where individuals mistake shadows on the wall for reality itself. In Al-Ghazali's view, this is a pointed critique of those who accept superficial appearances without seeking the inner essence of things. Beyond the physical lies a more refined level, the realm of intellectual and abstract thought. This is the domain where philosophical inquiry takes place, engaging with universals, logical structures, and enduring metaphysical issues such as the distinction between essence and accident, necessity and contingency, cause and effect. Here, the light that enables knowledge is a higher-order intellect, capable not only of interpreting empirical data, but also of discerning the conceptual frameworks that structure our thinking. Al-Ghazali acknowledges the importance of this intellectual domain and affirms the role of philosophy in the search for truth. However, he also underscores its limitations. The chief shortcoming of purely rational knowledge, he argues, is its detachment from personal transformation. One may come to understand God intellectually and describe divine attributes in precise terms. Yet this cognitive grasp does not necessarily lead to spiritual growth. Without being accompanied by direct, lived experience, such knowledge remains theoretical, capable of informing, but not of transforming. The final and highest level Al-Ghazali describes is the realm of spiritual reality itself, a dimension that cannot be accessed by reason alone, but is unveiled through divine illumination. This form of knowledge arises only when the soul, refined through ethical discipline and spiritual practice, becomes receptive to the grace of divine revelation. At this stage, knowing God is no longer an abstract exercise in theology. It becomes an immediate, experiential awareness, a direct encounter with the divine. At this supreme level, knowledge is not something the intellect achieves independently. It is a gift, a result of divine self-disclosure that occurs when the heart is purified and made transparent to the light of truth. Al-Ghazali's portrayal of this stage is both precise and balanced. He avoids the pitfalls of anthropomorphizing God or reducing divine reality to an impersonal abstraction. Instead, he presents a profound vision in which authentic spiritual knowledge involves a participatory awareness, a union that transcends the typical divide between subject and object. Yet even as he emphasizes the intimacy of this encounter, he remains committed to preserving the fundamental distinction between creator and creation, maintaining the theological boundaries while describing an experience of deep spiritual closeness. The implications of Al-Ghazali's three-tiered model of knowledge are both profound and far-reaching in scope. He underscores that genuine spiritual progress requires a balanced and integrated engagement with all three levels of understanding. Foundational stages such as empirical perception and rational analysis are not to be abandoned in the quest for deeper truths. Rather, they are essential stepping stones. These faculties sharpen the intellect, fostering accurate observation and clear reasoning, skills that are crucial in preparing the soul for higher levels of insight. Yet, although reason and sensory perception are foundational, they are not the end point. Al-Ghazali makes clear that true knowledge ultimately transcends these tools, not by discarding them, but by moving beyond their inherent limitations. To do this, one must undertake what he calls the purification of the heart, a rigorous process of ethical and spiritual refinement aimed at removing internal barriers that prevent the soul from receiving divine illumination. These inner obstructions go beyond obvious moral failings such as arrogance, avarice, or hatred. They also include subtler and more deceptive forms of egoic entanglement, especially those linked to intellectual or spiritual pride. A scholar overly attached to their knowledge, a mystic infatuated with personal spiritual experiences, or a philosopher too confident in their reasoning abilities, all risk obstructing the humility required for authentic receptivity to divine wisdom. According to Al-Ghazali, this purification entails both the negation of harmful traits and the cultivation of noble ones. On the negative side, it involves systematically identifying and dissolving spiritual diseases that cloud the heart's natural luminosity, preventing it from reflecting divine truth as a clean mirror reflects light. This includes not only avoiding immoral behavior, but also developing a refined inner sensitivity capable of detecting and dispelling subtler forms of ego and delusion. On the positive side, purification nurtures virtues that elevate the soul's receptivity to higher forms of knowledge. Traits such as humility dismantle the ego's barriers, creating space for divine wisdom to enter. Gratitude reinforces the awareness that true knowledge is bestowed by God, not manufactured by human effort. Patience strengthens the soul's endurance through spiritual trials, and love ignites the total surrender required for ultimate union with the divine. Al-Ghazali's treatment of love is among his most original contributions to philosophical psychology. He portrays love not merely as a feeling, but as an epistemological mode, a way of knowing that fuses intellectual understanding with lived experiential depth. The lover does not merely comprehend the beloved in abstract terms, but enters into a participatory form of knowledge that surpasses mere conceptualization while still honoring reason. In this light, the sincere seeker who cultivates deep love for the divine gains access to layers of understanding unavailable to those who rely exclusively on intellectual study. Nonetheless, Al-Ghazali is careful to distinguish true divine love from emotionalism. Authentic love of God is not simply an emotional state. It demands a radical reorientation of the self, aligning one's will and desire with their divine source and ultimate aim. This inner transformation redefines every dimension of life. It alters how one sees the world, engages with others, and participates in everyday experiences. To claim love for the divine without corresponding changes in thought, emotion, and behavior is to fall into the trap of spiritual self-deception. In the niche of lights, Al-Ghazali reaches the pinnacle of his vision with a depiction of a consciousness fully permeated by divine light. In this elevated state, the ego is not destroyed, but it becomes so completely aligned with the will of God that all tension between personal desire and eternal truth disappears. The individual remains an active participant in worldly life, with personal responsibilities and relationships intact, yet now sees everything through the lens of divine reality rather than through the distortions of self-interest. Part 6. The Psychology of Transformation. Al-Ghazali's deepest psychological insights emerge through his exploration of the human capacity for profound inner change, a shift from a state of spiritual disorientation and ignorance to one of luminous clarity and true understanding. This transformation transcends the mere accumulation of facts or enhancement of intellectual faculties. Rather, it signifies a fundamental reconfiguration of the self, reshaping how one thinks, feels, perceives reality, and connects with others, the world, and the divine. Central to this metamorphosis is Al-Ghazali's concept of the heart, not the physical organ, but the spiritual center of consciousness. He makes a clear distinction between the biological heart and what he calls the spiritual heart, which he sees as the seat of insight, emotion, and ethical awareness. This heart, in his understanding, is an immaterial and delicate essence, subtle in form, and intimately tied to the body, yet not confined by it. For Al-Ghazali, this spiritual heart is the authentic core of human identity, the source from which genuine knowledge and meaningful action flow. In its original, untainted state, it possesses an innate ability to perceive higher truths. He compares it to a polished mirror, inherently capable of reflecting divine light. Yet, this clarity is frequently obscured by layers of distortion caused by faulty reasoning, toxic emotions, and morally compromising behavior. These accumulating distortions form what Al-Ghazali symbolically describes as rust that coats the heart, impairing its capacity to grasp spiritual reality. The path of inner transformation, therefore, demands a disciplined and intentional effort to cleanse the heart of these obstructions, allowing it to fulfill its true role as a conduit for divine illumination. Al-Ghazali identifies the main barriers to this transformation as spiritual maladies that dull the heart's natural perceptiveness. The first type he addresses are what he calls the diseases of belief, misguided convictions that deform one's perception of ultimate truth. These false beliefs may manifest as naive superstitions or as complex philosophical errors, and they can ensnare even the most brilliant minds. To counteract such misconceptions, Al-Ghazali champions a mode of understanding that integrates divine revelation, sound reasoning, and authentic spiritual experience. However, he warns that intellectual correction alone is insufficient. Lasting transformation requires more than cognitive clarity. It calls for the healing of one's emotional life and volitional impulses as well. The second category of spiritual disease involves emotional dysfunctions that disturb a person's relationship with both self and society. These range from overt emotional disorders, such as uncontrolled anger, paralyzing fear, and chronic sadness, to more subtle forms of imbalance that may remain undetected in individuals who seem otherwise well-adjusted. Among these, pride is especially dangerous due to its corrosive effect on the capacity for spiritual insight. A prideful individual becomes overly invested in personal opinions, achievements, or social status, which inhibits their ability to recognize their own limitations or to receive truths that originate outside their own perspective. Al-Ghazali shows how pride often wears a mask of virtue, the scholar absorbed in their intellect, the mystic attached to their spiritual experiences, or the moral crusader intoxicated by their own sense of righteousness. The remedy for pride, in Al-Ghazali's view, is the cultivation of genuine humility, a deep awareness of one's reliance on sources of truth and power beyond the self. Practices that nurture this humility include regular contemplation of death, which starkly confronts the transience of life and exposes the vanity of worldly accomplishments. Engaging in selfless acts of service, particularly toward those who offer nothing in return, helps dismantle the ego and its illusions of superiority. Even more essential is the practice of rigorous and continual self-examination, which uncovers the subtle workings of the ego and exposes how pride can infiltrate even sincere spiritual efforts. Another emotional affliction that Al-Ghazali analyzes with psychological depth is envy. The envious person suffers at the success of others and derives pleasure from their misfortune, leading to a distorted and ultimately destructive engagement with the world. Al-Ghazali reveals that envy is inherently self-sabotaging. It distorts a person's vision, preventing them from appreciating the admirable qualities in others, qualities that could otherwise ignite their own growth and self-improvement. This envious outlook is also rooted in a fundamental misunderstanding of divine benevolence, the false belief that God's blessings are limited, doled out sparingly, rather than being boundless gifts that flourish through generosity and shared joy. To transcend envy, Al-Ghazali proposes the cultivation of what he calls spiritual magnanimity. This magnanimity entails a genuine capacity to celebrate the happiness and success of others. It is not achieved by forcefully suppressing jealousy, but by transforming how one perceives others and the universe itself. When the heart expands beyond ego-centered concerns and begins to feel compassion for all sentient beings, envy dissolves on its own. Other people's triumphs no longer appear as personal losses, but as collective joys to be shared. Anger, meanwhile, presents even greater complexity. It is a double-edged force, capable of both destruction and righteous action. On one side, it can manifest as moral indignation in the face of injustice, fueling courageous acts of reform and defense of the oppressed. Yet on the other, when left unchecked, anger corrodes inner peace and blurs the clarity required for principled judgment. Al-Ghazali provides guidance for discerning the difference between anger that arises from a sincere commitment to justice and that which stems from ego, pride, or the thirst for vengeance. To purify anger, one must cultivate what he terms spiritual strength, a disciplined inner capacity to respond with wisdom rather than instinctual reaction. This does not demand the suppression of strong emotions, but their elevation toward virtuous aims. The individual endowed with spiritual strength can confront wrongdoing with firmness and moral clarity, without becoming ensnared by bitterness or hatred. In contrast, greed and material attachment represent more covert but equally corrosive spiritual afflictions, especially in societies that idolize wealth and consumption. Al-Ghazali explores the inner workings of greed, showing it is not rooted in a sincere love of life's blessings, but in an anxious striving for security through endless accumulation. Such a person remains perpetually unfulfilled, trapped in the illusion that material goods can satisfy spiritual hunger, like someone trying to slake their thirst with seawater. The remedy for this delusion, Al-Ghazali teaches, is the development of spiritual poverty, a deep inner awareness that lasting contentment arises not from possession, but from trust in divine providence. This does not mean renouncing all worldly belongings or choosing destitution, but rather transforming one's relationship with wealth. A spiritually poor person views possessions as instruments for service and goodness, not as ultimate sources of meaning or identity. But Al-Ghazali's teachings move beyond personal emotional struggles. He delves into the more fundamental distortions in human awareness that prevent individuals from grasping their true spiritual condition. He describes the ordinary state of human consciousness as one of spiritual sleep, a kind of inner blindness to one's deepest yearnings and noblest capacities. In this dormant state, people pursue goals and distractions that offer temporary gratification, while leaving the underlying existential void unaddressed. Awakening from this slumber requires the deliberate cultivation of deep self-awareness, the ability to perceive the hidden structures shaping one's inner life, and to begin the arduous but liberating work of spiritual transformation. This awakening rests upon what Al-Ghazali calls vigilant self-examination, a continuous practice of attentively observing one's thoughts, emotions, intentions, and behaviors in order to diagnose spiritual ailments and track progress toward inner maturity. Yet, he warns that such introspection must be grounded in a steadfast reliance on divine compassion and guidance. Without this balance, self-observation can devolve into a form of spiritual self-absorption, where the seeker becomes trapped in egoic scrutiny rather than opening to the boundless dimensions of transcendent reality. Part 7. Understanding the Science of the Heart. Central to Al-Ghazali's psychological and philosophical framework is a revolutionary concept of the qalb, or spiritual heart, not as a poetic symbol, but as an actual faculty of knowing. In his view, the heart operates in accordance with specific principles and can be deliberately trained and cultivated to attain profound levels of insight and understanding. This perspective directly challenges two prevalent but opposing approaches. On one end, the notion that spiritual insight is merely an expression of emotion, and on the other, the materialist assumption that equates consciousness solely with brain function. Al-Ghazali rejects both extremes, offering instead a comprehensive and methodical science of the heart. In this view, the heart is a cognitive organ that, once purified, can intuitively grasp truths that remain inaccessible to ordinary perception. He introduces the concept of spiritual perception, a distinctive form of awareness that integrates sensory experience, rational analysis, and mystical insight, yet ultimately surpasses all three. Just as the eye objectively perceives light and form regardless of emotional state, the spiritual heart, when properly refined, perceives layers of reality that are both objective and ordinarily hidden. These layers encompass far more than mystical or divine realities. They include moral truths and aesthetic qualities, dimensions of human existence essential for genuine well-being, yet beyond the reach of reason and empirical data alone. According to Al-Ghazali, the heart is innately tuned to such realities, but this sensitivity becomes dulled over time by what he calls spiritual rust, a metaphor describing the accumulation of harmful beliefs, toxic emotions, and unethical behaviors. This impairment is not a punishment inflicted by the divine, but rather a natural consequence of living in ways that distort or suppress the heart's original function. Just as the eyes can be damaged by excessive light or hearing by persistent noise, the spiritual faculties of the heart degrade under prolonged exposure to inner and outer corruption. Importantly, unlike physical damage, this spiritual degradation is not permanent. Al-Ghazali presents a detailed path to spiritual restoration, a healing journey aimed at regaining the heart's innate clarity and receptivity. This journey begins with a courageous confrontation of one's spiritual condition. Many avoid this reckoning, preferring to cling to comforting illusions rather than face the reality of their distorted worldviews. True transformation begins with recognizing the deep flaws in one's habitual ways of thinking and perceiving. The first milestone in this transformative process is what Al-Ghazali refers to as repentance. But his interpretation of repentance goes far beyond a fleeting sense of regret for individual wrongdoings. It entails a complete reorientation of the self, moving away from self-dependence and control toward wholehearted surrender to divine wisdom and mercy. Repentance, in Al-Ghazali's system, unfolds in three interconnected dimensions. The first is intellectual, a rejection of false or limiting beliefs that cloud one's vision of reality. The second is emotional, the process of replacing destructive desires with virtues such as humility, compassion, and patience. The third is volitional, a redirection of the will from selfish or worldly pursuits toward a life devoted to higher purposes and truths. Once the inner self is cleared through sincere repentance, the next stage involves disciplined spiritual development, or riyada. This stage focuses on refining the heart's ability to perceive spiritual realities, while simultaneously reducing the influence of worldly distractions and internal disarray. Spiritual training, as outlined by Al-Ghazali, encompasses both external practices and internal disciplines. Outwardly, this includes acts such as prayer, fasting, and charitable giving. Inwardly, it involves contemplative practices like meditation, remembrance of God, dhikr, and deep engagement with theological and existential reflection. However, Al-Ghazali strongly emphasizes that these practices must be grounded in genuine knowledge, not in blind enthusiasm or mere imitation. He also makes clear that the spiritual path must be tailored to each individual. The right method depends on one's temperament, life circumstances, and spiritual maturity. A practice that helps one person thrive may hinder another, and even the same practice may lose its benefit if not adjusted over time to match one's evolving needs. A sincere spiritual seeker must be guided by someone both deeply grounded in spiritual wisdom and acutely aware of the human psyche. This kind of teacher doesn't offer one-size-fits-all advice, but instead provides instruction that speaks directly to the unique circumstances, emotional makeup, and spiritual readiness of each student. Al-Ghazali identifies the third stage of spiritual growth as the attainment of tahakkuk, or spiritual realization, a profound state where previously abstract truths, once accepted through belief or intellectual reasoning, are now known through direct, personal experience. This transformation does not arrive all at once. Rather, it unfolds gradually as the heart becomes more refined in its capacity to perceive spiritual realities. With time, the seeker reaches a level where fundamental truths are apprehended without dependence on rational arguments or external validation. At this stage, both ethical guidance and knowledge of the deeper nature of reality arise from within, illuminated by the heart's inner clarity. Nevertheless, Al-Ghazali issues a critical warning. Not every inward experience represents genuine spiritual insight. Many aspirants may confuse emotional intensity, vivid inner imagery, or psychological disturbances for true enlightenment. While these episodes may feel powerful or significant, they often mask forms of illusion or self-deception, rather than reflecting real spiritual awakening. The measure of authentic spiritual insight lies in its lasting impact. True realization brings with it an increase in wisdom, a deepened sense of compassion, and a refinement of character. In contrast, counterfeit experiences often result in inflated egos, erratic emotions, and moral deterioration. Al-Ghazali explores the heart as a profound locus of knowing, showing how spiritual insight and rational thought are not only compatible, but mutually enhancing. Far from undermining reason, genuine spiritual clarity strengthens it. When the heart is cleansed and spiritually awakened, one's ability to think clearly and judge wisely is heightened. Spiritual perception does not replace logical analysis with impulsive emotion. Rather, it deepens the intellect's reach, enriching reasoning with insight and nuance. Al-Ghazali calls this synthesis spiritual intelligence, a refined form of understanding that balances intuitive awareness with critical thought, avoiding both cold rationalism and unchecked emotionalism. This spiritual intelligence enables individuals to discern when to rely on analysis and when to draw from deeper inner knowledge. It sharpens their perception of the sacred within ordinary moments and gives practical expression to spiritual truths that might otherwise seem distant or theoretical. The heart's highest evolution culminates in what Al-Ghazali describes as spiritual transparency, a state where the individual becomes wholly aligned with ultimate truth while still maintaining their personal identity and individuality. People who reach this stage continue to engage with life through their own skills, passions, and responsibilities. However, they are no longer driven by ego or selfish desire. Their inner vision has been purified to such a degree that they perceive all of existence through the lens of divine reality. They become clear instruments through which spiritual light flows into the world, fully alive and human, yet radiant with transcendent awareness, never dissolving into abstraction or losing their human distinctiveness. Part 8. The Alchemy of Happiness. In his celebrated Persian work intended for a broader audience beyond scholarly circles, Al-Ghazali presents a profound and accessible vision of what it means to achieve true human fulfillment. The Alchemy of Happiness is not merely a simplified version of his earlier Arabic writings. It serves as a refined synthesis of his deepest spiritual and intellectual insights, offering readers practical guidance shaped by a lifetime of reflection. The title is richly metaphorical. Just as ancient alchemists sought to transform ordinary metals into gold by mastering the hidden principles of nature, Al-Ghazali illustrates how the human soul can be elevated from a state of confusion and spiritual poverty to one of luminous, lasting joy through the disciplined pursuit of spiritual understanding and self-cultivation. He begins by posing a fundamental question at the heart of all meaningful philosophical and spiritual inquiry. What constitutes true happiness, and how can it be attained with certainty? Al-Ghazali observes that although every person instinctively yearns for happiness, the majority are led astray by misconceptions about where it truly lies. Many people believe happiness resides in the satisfaction of physical appetites, the accumulation of wealth, social prestige, or intellectual achievement. While such pursuits may offer temporary pleasure or practical utility, they ultimately fall short of providing the deep, abiding contentment that the soul seeks. The problem does not lie in these pursuits themselves, but in the mistaken assumption that they represent life's highest goal. Al-Ghazali carefully reveals the limitations of each. Bodily pleasures are fleeting and addictive. Wealth is unstable and never guarantees peace. Fame depends on the unpredictable opinions of others, and even the highest intellectual endeavors often leave the ultimate mysteries of existence unresolved. To attain happiness that is authentic and enduring, one must seek a foundation beyond the transitory and the uncertain. It must be grounded in a relationship with that which is eternal, unchanging, and utterly reliable. In Al-Ghazali's framework, this ultimate source of reality is what religion calls God, and what philosophy may describe as the absolute, the one, or pure being. Yet such knowledge cannot remain theoretical or detached. It must be internalized, lived out, and embodied in daily practice. Only through this full integration can it yield the profound transformation of the soul that leads to genuine happiness. Al-Ghazali structures this transformative process into 4 essential kinds of knowledge, each representing a stage in what he refers to as spiritual alchemy. These stages are not separate academic disciplines, but interconnected movements in the soul's ascent from ordinary awareness to intimate realization of the divine. Importantly, this path is not limited to intellectual development. Each stage involves a deep reorientation in how one thinks, feels, and behaves in relation to the self, to others, and to the world at large. The journey begins with knowledge of the self. This requires uncovering the true nature of human consciousness and recognizing its relationship to the body. Most people mistakenly identify themselves with their physical form, emotions, thoughts, or social personas. But Al-Ghazali emphasizes that the true self is none of these. It is the spiritual essence that uses these faculties without being defined by them. This deeper self has needs and dimensions that cannot be met by material possessions or social achievements alone. Understanding this is crucial because any effort to find lasting happiness through bodily indulgence or external success is doomed to fail when based on a false conception of the self. However, self-knowledge must go beyond abstract realization. It must become practical, enabling a person to wisely govern the interplay between the soul and its faculties. The body has legitimate needs that must be honored. Emotions, while often volatile, carry meaningful messages that should be understood. The intellect is a powerful tool that requires careful direction, and social relationships impose moral responsibilities that must be approached with integrity. Spiritual living is the practice of bringing every aspect of human existence into alignment with the soul's highest calling, without allowing any single dimension to dominate or confine that purpose. At the heart of this spiritual journey lies the pursuit of divine knowledge. This involves not only seeking to understand the attributes of God, but also discerning their relevance to the created world. Yet, as Al-Ghazali emphasizes, such a pursuit must begin with a sober recognition of the limitations of human intellect when faced with the infinite. Human cognition and language rely on finite, conceptual frameworks, tools that, by their very nature, fall short of fully encompassing the absolute and limitless nature of the divine. However, this does not render the knowledge of God impossible. Rather, it calls for an approach grounded in humility, one that acknowledges these constraints while remaining open to forms of understanding that transcend analytical thought. Authentic knowledge of God includes an awareness of the divine names and qualities, which are disclosed through revelation, affirmed by reason, and enriched through direct spiritual insight. These attributes, eternal being, infinite knowledge, absolute power, perfect wisdom, and unbounded mercy, are not merely to be studied for intellectual satisfaction. Their true purpose lies in fostering inner transformation and moral growth. Meditating on God's mercy nurtures compassion in the seeker. Contemplation of divine wisdom cultivates discernment. Recognition of divine beauty inspires a personal commitment to moral and spiritual refinement. An equally essential element of the path is discerning the real nature of the temporal world. This means piercing the veils of illusion and misperception that typically obscure our understanding of worldly existence. While many perceive the world as a series of isolated entities and events promising lasting happiness if managed correctly, Al-Ghazali asserts that the world functions more accurately as a tapestry of symbols, each pointing beyond itself to deeper spiritual truths. All that exists, reflects aspects of the divine, like mirrors catching glimpses of a greater reality. Those who learn to interpret these reflections with spiritual clarity find lessons woven throughout the fabric of the universe. This does not suggest that the world is mere illusion or without worth. Rather, its true value lies not in the fulfillment of worldly desires, but in its capacity to guide the soul toward transcendence. The beauty in nature evokes a sense of divine aesthetics. The harmony and structure of the natural world speak to divine intelligence. The interdependence of all life forms unveils the unity that underlies creation's apparent diversity. Still, such insights are not automatically granted. They become accessible only to hearts and minds shaped by reverence, attentiveness, and discernment. Another foundational aspect of spiritual realization is understanding the reality of the hereafter. This means seeing the next world not as a distant or speculative idea, but as an eternal dimension of existence already present, though largely veiled from ordinary perception. For Al-Ghazali, the afterlife is not merely a continuation of existence after death, but the full awakening of the soul's spiritual faculties, some of which can begin to emerge even during earthly life. Grasping the reality of the next world allows one to reinterpret this life through a more expansive lens, where every decision carries eternal significance. When one internalizes the enduring impact of their actions, their values, priorities, and choices naturally shift away from short-term gratification toward lasting purpose. This deeper awareness, however, does not call for retreat from the world. Instead, it invites integration. Those who truly understand the eternal dimension are not less engaged with life, but more purposeful within it. Far from abandoning their worldly responsibilities, they approach them with clarity, intention, and a spirit attuned to higher aims. Al-Ghazali presents these four types of knowledge: of God, of the world, of the self, and of the next life, as interdependent forces in a sacred process of transformation. Like ingredients in a spiritual alchemy, they work together to transmute the soul from a state of ignorance to one of luminous awareness. This profound shift cannot be achieved by intellectual learning alone, though sound knowledge is indispensable. It also demands rigorous spiritual practice, disciplines that refine the heart and prepare it to receive divine illumination. Conversely, spiritual practice without the anchor of accurate knowledge can be just as hazardous. Passion untempered by understanding may lead not to awakening, but to delusion. The joy that results from this inner metamorphosis is unlike any pleasure the material world can provide. It is a fulfillment that exists independently of changing circumstances, untouched by the rise and fall of wealth, status, health, or even mortality itself. It engenders a sense of wholeness so complete that worldly possessions become enhancements, not necessities. Most significantly, this inner joy radiates outward, manifesting as deeper empathy, greater service to humanity, and a heightened capacity to fulfill the noble purposes for which human beings were created. Part 9. Integrating the Pathways. Al-Ghazali's most profound philosophical legacy lies not in a singular doctrine or argument, but in his masterful integration of diverse intellectual and spiritual traditions, many of which were previously considered fundamentally at odds. He demonstrated that rational inquiry, authentic mystical experience, faithful adherence to divine revelation, and conscientious participation in social life are not conflicting pursuits, but essential components of a unified vision of human flourishing. This integrative outlook reflects both the complexity of the human condition and the layered nature of reality. Crucially, this integration did not rely on superficial compromises or evasive reconciliations. Instead, Al-Ghazali conducted a deep and disciplined investigation into the proper domains and limits of each path. He identified that the perceived tensions, whether between logic and revelation, inner development and public responsibility, or mystical insight and practical action, often stem from confusion about the distinct functions of each, rather than from any real contradiction between them. When each sphere is accurately understood and engaged within its appropriate bounds, they cease to compete and instead begin to enrich one another. Among Al-Ghazali's most lasting philosophical achievements is his refined reconciliation of reason and revelation. He argued that reason, when pursued with intellectual honesty, eventually arrives at fundamental questions it cannot resolve independently, questions for which revealed knowledge offers definitive answers. Revelation, far from stifling rationality, provides the essential structure that allows reason to operate with clarity and precision. Through rational reflection, one can come to recognize the existence of God, the plausibility of prophetic guidance, and the imperative of ethical conduct. Yet reason alone cannot uncover the specific content of divine law or chart the full course of spiritual realization. Revelation fills this gap by delivering precise moral and spiritual instruction, while at the same time affirming the broader truths that reason can grasp on its own. Thus, the apparent conflict between these sources of knowledge usually arises from flawed reasoning or misinterpretations of sacred texts, not from any inherent opposition. When such a conflict appears, Al-Ghazali insists on a critical reassessment. Are the rational claims logically sound? Are the scriptural sources being correctly understood? His critique of earlier philosophers demonstrates this approach, revealing how many of their critiques of religious doctrine rested on unverified assumptions rather than valid logical analysis. Al-Ghazali also directly addressed the enduring tension between the pursuit of personal spiritual refinement and the fulfillment of communal obligations. Certain mystical traditions placed so much emphasis on individual enlightenment that they encouraged disengagement from worldly concerns. On the other hand, some schools of thought emphasized social reform to such an extent that they neglected the necessity of inner ethical transformation. To Al-Ghazali, these two paths are not opposed but deeply interconnected. Authentic spiritual growth enhances one's capacity to serve society with compassion, integrity, and meaningful intent. As individuals deepen their spiritual awareness, their empathy, moral clarity, and commitment to justice become more refined, qualities that are foundational for responsible social action. Conversely, active engagement in social and familial responsibilities, especially when directed toward those who offer nothing in return, can itself become a powerful vehicle for spiritual development. Everyday roles in family life, work, and civic engagement continually challenge individuals to cultivate patience, humility, and altruism, all of which are essential to true spiritual maturity. Finally, Al-Ghazali refuted the common belief that mystical experiences lead to disengagement from the world or are mere fantasies detached from real life. He contended that genuine spiritual insight actually strengthens a person's ability to act in the world with purpose and effectiveness. Rather than withdrawing from responsibility, deep mystical realization equips individuals with the inner clarity, compassion, and steadfastness required to face life's complexities with renewed strength and direction. When a person gains direct experiential insight into the ultimate nature of reality, they tap into deep reservoirs of wisdom, resilience, and inner drive. Far from reducing their ability to act effectively in the world, this realization actually enhances their capacity to engage in noble and purposeful endeavors. However, it is essential to distinguish authentic spiritual insight from misleading or counterfeit experiences, which even sincere seekers might wrongly believe to be genuine. Al-Ghazali provides thorough and well-defined criteria for making this vital distinction. True mystical experience is always reflected in visible ethical growth, increased discernment in practical matters, and a greater ability to serve others with humility and sincerity. In contrast, experiences that breed spiritual pride, emotional instability, or neglect of legitimate worldly obligations cannot be considered authentic, regardless of how compelling or emotionally intense they may feel. This commitment to integration also informs Al-Ghazali's view of the world's various religious and philosophical traditions. Rather than asserting that truth can only be found in a single tradition, he explores what each perspective has to offer in deepening our understanding of reality and enhancing human well-being. He extracts meaningful insights from philosophers, theologians, and mystics, recognizing the value each can contribute. At the same time, Al-Ghazali is fully aware of the shortcomings and limitations that each of these approaches may carry. He does not suggest that any single tradition holds an exclusive claim to truth. His inclusive vision does not arise from a relativistic denial of objective truth, but from the conviction that ultimate reality is vast and multifaceted, accessible through multiple lenses without undermining its underlying unity. Al-Ghazali's integrative method serves as a compelling model for addressing the challenges posed by conflicting systems of thought and diverse approaches to personal and collective development in the modern world. His writings show that it is possible to uphold rigorous standards for discerning truth while remaining open to insights that emerge outside the boundaries of any one academic discipline or spiritual methodology. He affirms the power of rational investigation, yet he also acknowledges that reason by itself cannot answer life's most profound questions about meaning, values, and ultimate purpose. Al-Ghazali stresses the importance of personal spiritual development, but he does so without promoting an inward turn that neglects social engagement or leads to excessive preoccupation with inner experiences. What sets his vision apart is its deeply practical orientation, not just its philosophical depth. Al-Ghazali outlines clear and actionable guidance for embodying this integrated path in daily life. Through his revitalization of the religious sciences, he shows that every aspect of human behavior, from private routines to the complexities of social life, can be transformed into a path of spiritual growth and alignment with ultimate truth. This kind of applied wisdom makes his teachings not only relevant, but accessible to people from all backgrounds, regardless of their scholarly or educational status. What gives enduring relevance to Al-Ghazali's integrative outlook is its engagement with perennial human dilemmas. Across cultures and throughout history, people have struggled to reconcile faith with reason, personal growth with collective responsibility, and high spiritual ideals with the demands of ordinary existence. Al-Ghazali's responses to these timeless challenges remain powerfully resonant because they are anchored in a deep understanding of both human nature and the structure of reality. His integrated vision offers a flexible yet principled framework that remains adaptable to shifting circumstances, while always grounded in the essential truths that support genuine human flourishing. Part 10. The Mirror of Divine Names. Al-Ghazali's most groundbreaking theological insight lies in his revolutionary reinterpretation of God's names and attributes, not as distant, abstract ideas, but as foundational guides for ethical conduct and spiritual evolution. Rather than treating the 99 beautiful names of God as mere descriptors of an unknowable, transcendent deity, Al-Ghazali presents them as profound instruments for understanding existence and unlocking the highest dimensions of the human soul. He asserts that when these names are truly understood and internalized, they not only describe divine reality, but also act as beacons for self-purification and moral refinement. His approach integrates disciplined rational analysis with deep experiential spirituality, reflecting the dual nature of his intellectual and mystical legacy. Each name becomes a lens through which one may perceive the divine and a channel for drawing closer to God through introspection, devotion, and ethical behavior. However, this inward journey requires subtle discernment. It is vital to differentiate between the divine qualities as reflected in human character and those that remain inimitably divine. For example, to embody mercy in one's life, one must clearly recognize the gap between the limited compassion of humans and the boundless mercy of the divine. Take Al-Ghazali's reflection on the name Ar-Rahman, often translated as the compassionate or the merciful. Intellectually, this name reveals that the foundation of existence is rooted in unconditional benevolence, not in indifference or arbitrary will. This insight reorients the human relationship to the world and to others. If compassion is woven into the very fabric of reality, then every act of kindness and care aligns us with the deeper order of creation, while cruelty and indifference rupture it. Yet, knowing this truth with the mind is not enough. Divine compassion must be realized and embodied in practice. This is not about complying with ethical rules out of duty, but about undergoing a profound inner transformation. It requires the dismantling of egoic patterns, such as self-centeredness, fear, and ignorance, that block the spontaneous flow of empathy. As these inner hindrances fall away, compassionate action emerges naturally, not as a moral obligation, but as the effortless expression of a heart that has been spiritually refined. Al-Ghazali likens this process to a kind of spiritual alchemy. Just as chemistry explains how specific conditions yield new compounds, this spiritual alchemy maps how inner states and practices combine to form new virtues and levels of awareness. The emergence of authentic compassion, for example, depends on the confluence of several essential components. First, is a lucid understanding of suffering, which provides the intellectual framework. This must be accompanied by emotional openness, the capacity to feel and respond to the pain of others, which fuels the desire to act. Equally crucial is practical discernment, ensuring that one's efforts to help are guided by wisdom rather than impulse, so that harm is not caused in the name of good intentions. Finally, spiritual endurance is necessary, enabling one to sustain compassion in the face of hardship, rejection, or personal loss. But Al-Ghazali's vision extends beyond the realm of personal ethics. He argues that the divine names also disclose the metaphysical structure of the universe itself. Consider the name Al-Hakim, meaning the wise. This attribute indicates that creation is neither arbitrary nor disordered, but governed by divine wisdom. Reality, according to this view, is intelligible and ordered, and human reason is capable, at least partially, of discerning and aligning with its underlying principles. This realization reshapes both metaphysical thought and moral practice. It implies that engaging with the divine names is not solely a path to virtue, but also a way of tuning oneself to the hidden harmony of the cosmos. To live in accordance with these names is to live in sync with the deeper logic of existence itself. If the structure of reality is governed by innate wisdom rather than chaos or chance, then the human pursuit of truth and well-being is not a rebellion against the nature of existence, but rather a deep resonance with it. This harmony instills both the conviction that truth is discoverable through sincere seeking and the resilience to persist in that search, even when clarity is elusive or delayed. It further suggests that actions grounded in authentic wisdom are inherently more fruitful than those propelled by cunning, impulsive emotions or uncritical acceptance of prevailing social norms. The divine name Al-Jamil, the beautiful, points to an ultimate reality marked not merely by utility or precision, but by elegance, proportion, and a radiant sense of grace. This unveils a higher form of human fulfillment, one that surpasses the simple pursuit of pleasure or the avoidance of pain. It is a fulfillment rooted in the experience and creation of genuine beauty, a beauty that mirrors the perfection of the divine. According to Al-Ghazali, beauty extends well beyond visual charm. It encompasses virtues of character, integrity in speech, justice in social structures, and a consciousness refined through disciplined spiritual practice. Cultivating this spiritual beauty, as Al-Ghazali teaches, begins with developing a kind of aesthetic discernment, the ability to distinguish between surface-level allure that feeds the senses or ego and profound beauty that reflects divine qualities. This discernment is deepened through careful reflection on the natural world, immersion in timeless art and literature, and, most importantly, by forming connections with individuals whose lives manifest the radiance of divine attributes. Yet this path also demands an inward purification, a clearing away of illusions, attachments, and inner distortions that prevent us from recognizing real beauty, even when it is right before our eyes. Al-Ghazali's meditation on the divine name As-Sabur, the patient, provides a powerful lens through which to understand how divine timelessness engages with human temporality. Divine patience is not a form of delay or indecision. Rather, it reflects a perfect, all-encompassing wisdom that acts precisely at the most fitting moment. From the standpoint of infinite knowledge and absolute power, there is no compulsion to act according to human timelines or urgency. Divine will unfold in ways that transcend the boundaries of time as we understand it. For individuals striving to embody divine patience in their own lives, a crucial distinction must be made. Patience born of insight and trust must not be confused with passivity rooted in fear, apathy, or avoidance. Genuine spiritual patience empowers a person to keep working toward meaningful goals without the need for immediate results, to endure adversity without losing faith in divine justice and compassion, and to commit to long-term visions even when their fulfillment lies beyond one's own lifetime. However, this virtue of patience is not an excuse for inaction or indifference in the face of injustice. Enduring what could be prevented or remaining silent where moral clarity calls for intervention is not the patience Al-Ghazali upholds. True patience involves active engagement with the world, grounded in faith and sustained by wisdom. Ultimately, Al-Ghazali teaches that the fullest expression of human potential lies in integrating the divine names into one's character, what he refers to as the realization of the complete human being. This does not mean achieving flawlessness in the absolute sense, but rather cultivating a soul that reflects, as much as humanly possible, the harmonious balance of divine attributes. Such a person embodies mercy without abandoning justice, expresses compassion guided by wisdom, practices patience fortified by strength, and reveals beauty inseparable from truth. Reaching this level of spiritual refinement requires sustained inner work, supported by authentic understanding and rigorous self-discipline, but it stands as the highest aim of the human path. Moreover, this vision extends beyond the personal. Its transformative power reaches into all dimensions of human society. Families, communities, economies, and political systems operate most justly and effectively when they are shaped by a balanced integration of divine qualities, rather than by overemphasizing some while neglecting others. For example, a society that enshrines justice but forgets mercy becomes harsh and punitive. One that favors mercy without justice risks moral decay and permissiveness. A culture obsessed with truth, yet blind to beauty, becomes sterile and uninspiring, while a pursuit of beauty devoid of truth descends into illusion and manipulation. Al-Ghazali's profound insights into the divine names offer not only a powerful vision of what individuals and societies can strive to become, but also a practical blueprint for building institutions that support true human flourishing, a flourishing that rises far above surface-level success or material gain. Part 11. The Architecture of Certainty. Al-Ghazali's influential contributions to epistemology are rooted in his meticulous exploration of what it means to be certain and the precise conditions required to achieve it. He challenges the notion of certainty as a binary state, instead offering a sophisticated framework that distinguishes between types and levels of assured knowledge. In his view, each domain of inquiry demands its own standard and method for reaching certainty. At the heart of this framework lies what Al-Ghazali calls immediate certainty, a direct, intuitive awareness that the mind has of itself and its most elemental functions. This foundational form of knowledge includes an indubitable recognition of one's conscious experience, an insight that would later be echoed by Descartes' famous axiom. For Al-Ghazali, it also encompasses the self's innate awareness of its own cognitive faculties, its ability to distinguish between mental states, and its natural orientation toward truth rather than falsehood. This immediate awareness serves as the cornerstone upon which all other knowledge must be built. Attempts to undermine it inevitably rely on the very cognitive tools it validates, making such skepticism inherently self-contradictory. Still, Al-Ghazali acknowledges that while this form of certainty is unassailable within its limited domain, it cannot fully account for the complexities of human experience. Though the self may be entirely certain of its existence and core operations, it cannot, through introspection alone, verify whether its sensory perceptions correspond to external reality, whether its logical deductions align with objective truth, or whether its moral intuitions reflect genuine values rather than subjective impressions or cultural conditioning. Addressing these deeper issues calls for more advanced methods of inquiry, ones that go beyond the immediate scope of inner awareness. To meet this need, Al-Ghazali introduces a second, higher level of certainty: demonstrative certainty. This is the knowledge obtained through systematic reasoning, grounded in clearly articulated premises. It is the domain of disciplines such as mathematics, formal logic, and empirical sciences, fields that depend on carefully defined methodologies and structured analysis. Through demonstrative reasoning, the mind can extend far beyond the confines of direct self-awareness. It can grasp abstract systems, predict future outcomes, and identify universal principles that apply across diverse contexts. Al-Ghazali commends this form of reasoning, arguing that when properly conducted, it produces conclusions as certain as those of immediate awareness, yet with a far wider scope of application. For example, mathematical demonstrations reveal immutable relationships between abstract entities independent of time, place, or the state of the thinker. Likewise, well-executed empirical research uncovers consistent patterns in the natural world, enabling both explanation and prediction, as well as practical innovations. Yet, Al-Ghazali is careful to underscore a fundamental limitation. Demonstrative certainty ultimately rests on assumptions that cannot themselves be demonstrated. In order to avoid circular arguments or an infinite regress of proofs, one must accept certain foundational principles, such as the axioms of mathematics, the laws of logic, and the basic premises of scientific method, on grounds external to the demonstrative process itself. These initial truths, though not provable through demonstration, are indispensable. Without them, the entire edifice of logical and empirical reasoning would be without support, and the structure of demonstrative knowledge would collapse. While demonstrative reasoning plays a crucial role in establishing conceptual links and identifying patterns among observed events, it remains fundamentally limited in its ability to penetrate the essence of reality. It cannot answer the deepest questions about meaning, value, or purpose. Recognizing this limitation, Al-Ghazali introduces a third and more profound kind of certainty, what he calls intuitive certainty. This form of knowledge emerges from direct spiritual insight, which transcends both rational deduction and sensory experience, while still being compatible with them. Intuitive certainty provides access to a level of understanding that goes beyond the reach of logic alone. It opens the door to awareness of ultimate truths, core values, and the deeper purpose of existence. Though it originates outside the realm of pure reason, when correctly understood, it can be affirmed through thoughtful reflection. According to Al-Ghazali, achieving this deeper form of knowing depends on the refinement and enlightenment of human consciousness, cultivated through dedicated spiritual discipline. Just as intellectual reasoning requires training in logic and empirical study, relies on careful observation, spiritual insight demands the development of inner faculties and the removal of internal obstacles that hinder higher perception. These obstacles, what Al-Ghazali calls spiritual diseases of the heart, such as arrogance, greed, and hatred, skew one's ability to perceive truth clearly. Overcoming them involves practices like prayer, meditation, and moral self-restraint, which help awaken and strengthen the heart's natural capacity for spiritual awareness. Al-Ghazali also lays out a rigorous method for distinguishing authentic intuitive certainty from false versions that may superficially resemble it, but are actually born of illusion, imagination, or mental disturbance. True spiritual knowledge, he asserts, is always aligned with sound reasoning and empirical evidence, provided that these are applied correctly and within their respective domains. Furthermore, genuine spiritual insight produces real, measurable outcomes. It improves a person's judgment, supports ethical behavior, and enhances their ability to engage with the world constructively. By contrast, any inner experience that clashes with established rational or empirical knowledge, or that leads to diminished moral clarity or practical wisdom, cannot be considered authentic, regardless of how convincing it might seem subjectively. In Al-Ghazali's view, complete knowledge arises from the harmonious integration of all three forms of certainty: rational, empirical, and intuitive. This comprehensive model respects the contributions of logic and observation while acknowledging their inherent limitations. Without the inclusion of spiritual perception, human understanding remains incomplete and incapable of addressing the most profound questions consciousness inevitably raises. Such a unified approach does not require diminishing any one domain of knowledge. Instead, it calls for a clear recognition of each domain's strengths and boundaries, and an intentional effort to integrate their insights into a cohesive understanding of reality and the human condition. This epistemological vision carries far-reaching consequences for education, research, ethics, and spiritual development. Educational systems that emphasize one form of knowledge at the expense of the others may produce individuals who are intellectually advanced but spiritually shallow, spiritually attuned yet analytically weak, or philosophically profound but ineffective in real-world contexts. A truly well-rounded education must cultivate critical thinking, empirical investigation, and spiritual insight, along with the integrative wisdom needed to bring them together. Likewise, research that limits itself strictly to rational or empirical methods may achieve notable success within narrow fields, but miss out on essential aspects of reality that can only be perceived through spiritual experience. Al-Ghazali's approach suggests that the most fruitful avenues of research are those that remain open to spiritual understanding, while also adhering to the high standards of logical consistency and empirical validation. This is not a rejection of scientific methodology, but an expansion of its scope to better reflect the layered and multi-dimensional character of existence. His conception of certainty also offers crucial guidance for moral decision-making, particularly in complex scenarios where ethical principles conflict or where outcomes are uncertain. Achieving true moral insight involves more than just understanding general rules and assessing facts. It also requires spiritual discernment, the ability to grasp the deeper meaning and long-term impact of different actions. This spiritual component enriches ethical reasoning, providing clarity where rational analysis alone may fall short, even as it supports and reinforces valid logical conclusions. Ultimately, Al-Ghazali's framework seeks to empower both mind and soul to reach a form of knowledge that is at once comprehensive and trustworthy, a knowledge that enables the full flourishing of human life. This vision of understanding goes beyond mastering abstract ideas or achieving material success. It demands spiritual awakening, through which one gains direct access to the ultimate truths and purposes that give coherence and meaning to all other forms of knowledge and action. Part 12. The Architecture of Reality. Central to Al-Ghazali's philosophical vision is a profound and integrated conception of existence, one that brings together rational analysis, mystical experience, and divinely revealed knowledge into a coherent framework. This metaphysical vision underpins his contributions across diverse disciplines, including epistemology, ethics, psychology, and spirituality. For Al-Ghazali, inquiries into knowledge, morality, the nature of the self, and spiritual development all arise from and return to the fundamental structure of being. His metaphysical system is rooted in the idea that reality is not a flat, uniform plane, but a stratified hierarchy. Each level of this hierarchy differs in its degree of independence, permanence, and causal efficacy. At the highest point of this ontological order is the divine, a reality that is unconditioned, uncaused, and entirely self-sustaining. God, in this framework, is not simply one being among many, but the foundational essence upon which all existence depends. Everything else derives its being, continuity, and purpose from this absolute source, while God remains wholly complete and unaffected by anything outside himself. Al-Ghazali's understanding of divine transcendence does not reduce God to an abstract principle or an impersonal force, as seen in some strands of philosophical theism. Rather, he insists that true transcendence includes immanence, that is, God's intimate involvement with creation. Because God surpasses all limitations, he can be universally present without occupying space, fully aware of all events without being subject to time, and active in the world without being limited by external conditions or internal needs. Just below the divine realm lies what Al-Ghazali refers to as the spiritual world, a dimension inhabited by angels, disembodied souls, and other purely spiritual entities. Although these beings are free from material constraints, their existence remains entirely contingent on God's creative will. This intermediate realm serves as a channel through which divine influence flows into the material cosmos, while also acting as a path through which creation can ascend toward its spiritual origin. Al-Ghazali's depiction of this spiritual domain is the product of a rich synthesis of philosophical rigor, mystical insight, and theological doctrine. From a philosophical standpoint, the existence of a mediating spiritual plane is necessary to reconcile the absolute unity of the divine with the multiplicity found in the physical world. Without such an intermediary, the emergence of complexity from divine simplicity would be difficult to account for without compromising either. From a mystical perspective, these spiritual entities correspond to specific levels of consciousness and existence that can be accessed by the human soul through inner purification and disciplined spiritual effort. In the context of revelation, figures like angels hold essential roles in cosmic administration and in guiding humanity toward its ultimate spiritual destiny. The final level of Al-Ghazali's metaphysical architecture is the physical realm, the domain of material substances, spatial dimensions, temporal sequences, and natural causation. This is the environment in which human life unfolds and where the process of spiritual refinement is carried out. Al-Ghazali presents this realm not as illusory or insignificant, but as real and orderly, governed by patterns that can be studied, understood, and utilized through empirical observation and rational inquiry. Nevertheless, the physical world is not self-sufficient. It is completely reliant on the spiritual domain above it, and ultimately on the divine for its origin, coherence, and purpose. The natural order functions not in isolation, but as a reflection of higher truths and a vessel through which spiritual realities are expressed. For Al-Ghazali, the material world is more than a backdrop for existence. It is a dynamic arena where divine signs are manifested and where the soul undertakes its transformative journey toward ultimate truth. Al-Ghazali's multi-tiered view of reality enables him to confront a central dilemma in the dialogue between faith and science. Whether spiritual and empirical explanations for natural phenomena are inherently contradictory or potentially complementary. He contends that these perspectives operate on different conceptual levels, each illuminating aspects of truth without negating the other, so long as they are properly understood. Science, in Al-Ghazali's view, uncovers the regularities through which divine wisdom ordinarily governs the physical universe. Spiritual understanding, on the other hand, transcends these observable patterns to apprehend their deeper origin and ultimate meaning. A scientist, for example, might describe fire-consuming cotton as the result of a chemical reaction between oxygen and cellulose, an accurate depiction of proximate causes. Yet this material explanation does not eliminate the necessity for a theological perspective, one that asks why a benevolent and intelligent Creator designed a world where such causal relationships exist and fulfill purposeful ends. Al-Ghazali's metaphysical framework delves further into the profound tension between necessity and contingency that underpins existence itself. He maintains that both are present in the cosmos, each occupying its own ontological domain and contributing uniquely to the divine plan. Fundamental truths, such as logical principles or mathematical laws, are deemed necessary, as they reflect the intrinsic order of divine wisdom and would be true in any possible world. By contrast, particular facts, like the placement of celestial bodies or the sequence of historical events, are contingent. They might have occurred differently without breaching any necessary truths. Nevertheless, contingency in Al-Ghazali's philosophy is not synonymous with arbitrariness. The specific form that contingent realities take is deliberate, chosen to fulfill precise roles within the Creator's overarching design. This sophisticated approach to necessity and contingency allows Al-Ghazali to navigate both metaphysical debates about divine sovereignty and practical concerns about moral responsibility. If everything in creation were necessary, then God's actions would be dictated by logic alone, leaving no room for choice, and human freedom would be an illusion, rendering accountability meaningless. On the other hand, if all things were purely contingent and lacked any inner order, the universe would become chaotic, and ethical behavior would lose its grounding in predictable consequences. Al-Ghazali resolves this by showing how divine wisdom constructs a reality that is simultaneously structured and open, predictable enough to be comprehensible and stable, yet flexible enough to accommodate both divine will and authentic human agency. The implications of Al-Ghazali's metaphysical insights extend into all areas of human experience. Understanding reality as a layered and ordered whole informs how individuals shape their personal values, how societies educate their members, how institutions are built, and how both personal aspirations and communal goals are pursued. Actions that resonate with the deeper order of reality are more likely to lead to meaningful and lasting success. This alignment, however, does not imply resignation to existing conditions or a retreat from striving. Instead, it suggests that genuine transformation is most effective when it works in harmony with the natural contours and intentions embedded within creation itself. Moreover, Al-Ghazali offers a compelling approach to a long-standing philosophical and theological question: the relationship between time and eternity. Rather than viewing them as opposing or disconnected realms, he presents time as a pathway through which eternal truths can be revealed and eternal purposes fulfilled by beings whose consciousness unfolds moment by moment. While humans are bound by temporal experience, they are nonetheless capable of perceiving timeless realities, forming relationships that transcend fleeting moments, and engaging in endeavors with everlasting significance. By weaving together the temporal and the eternal, Al-Ghazali offers a vision of life that satisfies both the immediate demands of daily existence and the deeper quest for ultimate meaning. Part 13. The Art of Spiritual Direction. Imam Al-Ghazali developed a profound and methodical understanding of spiritual development, allowing him to construct one of the most sophisticated and enduring models of spiritual mentorship in the Islamic tradition. His experience as both a dedicated seeker and an accomplished spiritual teacher, combined with his careful study of diverse spiritual temperaments, led him to design a nuanced and actionable framework for guiding the inner journey. By carefully observing the varied characteristics of spiritual seekers and evaluating the strategies employed by seasoned mentors, Al-Ghazali devised a comprehensive system that addressed the practical challenges faced by those leading others toward inner awakening and enlightenment. Central to his philosophy is the conviction that spiritual maturation, much like physical or intellectual growth, follows discernible principles that can be learned, understood, and applied by those trained in the art. Yet, Al-Ghazali was also clear that the path of the spirit is unlike other forms of human progress. While bodily development unfolds through natural biological processes and intellectual growth can be cultivated through structured education, spiritual transformation is a far more complex process, one that hinges on a delicate balance between human striving and divine grace. This essential tension, which he termed the paradox of spiritual instruction, lies at the heart of his teaching. For spiritual mentorship to be effective, the guide must combine deep psychological insight with a sincere humility rooted in reliance on divine assistance. Such a mentor needs to grasp how different practices affect varying personality types, recognize the origins and cures of spiritual ailments, and distinguish authentic spiritual advancement from its misleading counterparts. Still, no amount of theoretical knowledge can substitute for the lived experience of spiritual companionship. The relationship between teacher and seeker is not merely educational, it is a sacred channel through which divine illumination may pass. For Al-Ghazali, the qualifications of a spiritual mentor reflect a rare fusion of scholarly rigor and practical wisdom. A legitimate guide must possess a solid foundation in religious law, theology, and spiritual psychology, disciplines acquired through intensive training under qualified scholars. However, academic mastery is only part of the equation. A true guide must have personally traversed the inner path they propose to teach. Without first-hand experience of the spiritual terrain, with all its trials, pitfalls, and revelations, no one is fit to lead others through it. Theoretical knowledge alone cannot protect or direct seekers in the face of real spiritual danger. Moreover, the mentor's character and inner refinement are of utmost importance. Because the spiritual director holds significant influence over the psychological and spiritual development of their students, their presence can either nurture safe and accelerated growth or, if ungrounded, cause profound and lasting harm. For this reason, Al-Ghazali stressed that the guide must undergo a deep purification of the soul and attain a level of spiritual realization that ensures their guidance is free from ego, self-interest, or personal distortion. Only then can they serve as a reliable instrument of divine will. Al-Ghazali's model of spiritual mentorship reflects not only a profound grasp of human psychology, but also a deep sensitivity to the uniqueness of each person's inner journey. He identified several primary spiritual temperaments, each requiring a tailored approach to instruction and support. Some individuals, for example, are naturally inclined toward rational thinking and thus thrive in a path that emphasizes intellectual inquiry and reflection. Others are more emotionally receptive, finding spiritual depth through acts of devotion and heartfelt worship. Still others are practical by nature and respond best to a balanced combination of contemplative practice and active service in the world. However, Al-Ghazali warned against rigidly categorizing individuals into fixed types. He recognized that spiritual temperaments can shift over time and that genuine guidance must remain flexible, attuned to the evolving needs and stages of the seeker. The true art of spiritual direction, then, lies in the mentor's ability to adapt, to perceive subtle changes in the seeker's condition, and to offer the right form of support at the right moment. Most people are a complex blend of different temperaments, which means that spiritual growth often demands a thoughtful, balanced, and adaptable approach. Even those who naturally excel in one area must consciously work to develop traits that don't come easily to them. For example, individuals with a strong intellectual bent must eventually integrate emotional depth and willpower into their practice. Those who lead with emotion need to develop discernment and practical wisdom. Action-oriented people, in turn, must cultivate inner reflection and an appreciation for abstract thinking. This principle underlies Al-Ghazali's concept of graduated instruction, a structured approach to spiritual teaching that adjusts to the evolving needs of individuals at different stages in their journey. For beginners, this means receiving simple, direct guidance on essential practices and core values, along with consistent encouragement to persevere through the early difficulties, doubts, and periods of spiritual dryness that inevitably arise. As one advances, the instruction must become more refined. At the intermediate stage, practitioners are called to recognize and confront subtler inner flaws, deepen their inward focus, and begin integrating spiritual awareness with the demands of everyday life. For those who reach more advanced levels, the task becomes even more delicate. They must learn to navigate the heights of spiritual experience without succumbing to hidden dangers, particularly the subtle emergence of spiritual pride that can accompany real progress. Al-Ghazali places significant importance on the dynamic between personalized guidance and collective spiritual engagement. He emphasizes that human beings are both distinct individuals and inherently social creatures who grow best within a supportive community. While tailored instruction is essential, reflecting each person's temperament, life situation, and spiritual challenges, purely individualized paths can lead to imbalance, self-deception, and egotism. These risks are best mitigated through active participation in a community of fellow seekers under the direction of a wise and spiritually mature mentor. Therefore, the most effective model of spiritual formation combines one-on-one mentorship with meaningful involvement in a spiritual community. This dual structure not only ensures that individual needs are thoughtfully addressed, but also grounds the seeker in a network of mutual accountability and shared insight. One of Al-Ghazali's most enduring contributions to the field of spiritual education is his careful analysis of how to assess genuine spiritual progress and differentiate it from misleading or superficial experiences. He recognizes that spiritual growth largely unfolds in the realm of inner life, an arena that defies external observation and resists objective verification. This subjective nature makes it especially vulnerable to self-deception. A person may sincerely believe they have attained a high spiritual state, when in fact they are caught in subtle traps such as pride, emotional intoxication, or psychological phenomena that mimic but do not reflect true spiritual advancement. To help navigate this terrain, Al-Ghazali offers practical criteria that both seekers and their guides can use to evaluate the authenticity of spiritual experiences. Authentic growth is typically accompanied by a noticeable transformation in moral character, improved judgment in worldly affairs, a stronger inclination to serve others, and a deepening sense of humility. Conversely, any experience that leads to ethical lapses, declining effectiveness in daily responsibilities, increased self-absorption, or a feeling of spiritual superiority should be approached with great caution, no matter how vivid or uplifting it might appear. These evaluative tools are designed to protect both spiritual teachers and students from being misled by compelling but ultimately deceptive experiences that may signal regression rather than progress. Al-Ghazali's reflections on the art of spiritual mentorship emphasize that effective guidance involves more than knowledge or technique. It requires a profound commitment to moral integrity and spiritual accountability. He insists that a truly qualified guide must continually recognize their own need for further purification and remain dependent on divine grace. A teacher who imagines they have completed their spiritual journey and thus no longer need guidance themselves is at risk of stagnation and may gradually lose their ability to offer meaningful support to others. For this reason, an authentic spiritual mentor remains engaged in disciplined practice, seeks feedback from other trustworthy teachers, and always understands that their capacity to guide is not the result of personal virtue, but a gift sustained by the mercy and assistance of God. Part 14. The Social Dimension. Al-Ghazali's philosophical framework naturally extends from the personal realm into the fabric of communal life. For him, authentic spirituality cannot remain a purely internal or individual concern. It must actively shape the way societies function, informing family dynamics, economic systems, political governance, and social interaction. He firmly rejects the idea that spiritual growth is detached from civic and communal responsibility. He maintains that personal spiritual development enhances an individual's capacity to engage constructively with society. In turn, just and well-ordered social institutions provide fertile ground for the cultivation of spiritual virtues on a broader scale. His treatment of family life, central to his vision of a healthy society, reflects his deep integration of spiritual wisdom with practical guidance. To Al-Ghazali, marriage and family are not only social institutions, but also sacred avenues for spiritual advancement, provided they are approached with intentionality and a sincere heart. The emotional intensity and daily trials of close relationships present unique opportunities to nurture moral qualities like patience, empathy, humility, and selfless love, virtues that are often difficult to develop in isolation. Likewise, the act of parenting allows individuals to embody divine traits such as mercy, foresight, and sustained care, turning everyday responsibilities into profound spiritual exercises. Yet Al-Ghazali is careful to caution against the pitfalls of family life when it is shaped by ego, societal expectation, or material ambition rather than spiritual purpose. Marriages based on superficial attraction, social ambition, or economic gain may provide temporary satisfaction, but ultimately fail to fulfill the deeper human longing for meaning and connection. Likewise, parenting driven solely by the desire for outward success, whether academic, financial, or social, may produce accomplished individuals who nonetheless lack moral grounding or spiritual awareness. His ideal is captured in the notion of a conscious relationship, a vision in which romantic and parental bonds are seen as shared journeys toward spiritual growth, not merely sources of emotional comfort or obligations to tradition. Such relationships demand mutual commitment to inner development, where each partner supports the other's spiritual evolution, even when this challenges social norms or entails personal sacrifice. Parents, in this model, are not merely caretakers or providers. They are spiritual guides entrusted with the moral and inner cultivation of their children. Al-Ghazali extends these same principles into the economic sphere, proposing a concept he terms spiritual economics. In this model, economic life is not separated from ethical and spiritual considerations, but rather becomes a realm in which human dignity and divine purpose are upheld. Commercial and financial activity, when driven by intention, integrity, and service, can become acts of worship. Profit and productivity gain deeper meaning when they uplift communities, honor ethical boundaries, and help bridge social and spiritual divides. He is particularly concerned with the dangers posed by both extreme wealth and extreme poverty. Vast riches, if misused, can give rise to arrogance, greed, and a disconnection from the suffering of others. On the other hand, crushing poverty can lead to despair and an all-consuming focus on survival that leaves little room for reflection or moral growth. To counter these risks, Al-Ghazali promotes the principle of conscious sufficiency, a balanced state in which individuals possess enough resources to live with dignity and fulfill their responsibilities, but are not so consumed by wealth that it diverts them from higher purposes. This ideal is not just personal, but societal, suggesting a vision of economic life rooted in justice, ethical stewardship, and spiritual well-being. Individuals, under this ethic, are called not to hoard or chase status, but to manage their resources in ways that nurture their souls and contribute to the greater good. Economic systems should be designed to guarantee widespread access to what might be described as conscious sufficiency, a condition where every person can meet their fundamental needs, rather than maintaining systems that foster stark inequalities. These imbalances often lead to situations where some individuals are left without life's essentials, while others accumulate wealth far beyond any practical or ethical purpose. Al-Ghazali argues that political leadership should be firmly anchored in authentic spiritual values, which he views as the most reliable foundation for a just and well-functioning society. In Al-Ghazali's framework, legitimate political authority belongs to those who combine administrative skill with spiritual insight, leaders who are morally grounded enough to resist the corrupting tendencies that power so often brings. Such individuals must prioritize the public good above personal ambition or factional loyalty. The ideal leader, in his estimation, embodies both effective governance and a profound awareness of humanity's higher calling, guided by the principles of divine justice. Nonetheless, Al-Ghazali recognizes that political systems cannot be sustained by relying solely on rare individuals of exceptional spiritual caliber. Lasting stability and justice, he suggests, depend on institutions capable of operating under the direction of individuals with average moral and spiritual development. To that end, he proposes the implementation of institutional safeguards, mechanisms of accountability that check abuses of power, enable public oversight, and promote civic engagement. Additionally, he emphasizes the need for educational systems that instill ethical responsibility and prepare citizens to take on roles of principled leadership. His vision is not one of crafting a utopia governed by morally flawless individuals, but of building political structures that realistically advance human well-being within the constraints of human frailty and mixed motivations. Al-Ghazali promotes what he describes as organic transformation, a gradual, inward-driven process of societal reform rooted in the spiritual growth of individuals, rather than in sudden or superficial institutional changes that ignore deeper moral foundations. He maintains that societal corruption is ultimately a reflection of spiritual failings within individuals. Personal vices, greed, pride, hatred, and ignorance serve as the roots of exploitative economies, dishonest politics, and fractured communities. Therefore, meaningful and lasting reform must begin with cultivating individual virtue, addressing these inner disorders rather than focusing solely on altering external systems. Importantly, this perspective should not be mistaken for political quietism or acceptance of injustice as divinely ordained and unchangeable. Al-Ghazali clearly rejects the notion that oppressive conditions must be endured as fate. Instead, he champions a dual path. Personal spiritual refinement must occur alongside active engagement in reforming unjust social structures. Individuals are called to embody moral clarity while also participating in concrete efforts to strengthen the collective good. Institutions, in turn, must be reshaped to support and nurture the spiritual advancement of the individuals they serve. Regarding religious diversity and pluralism, Al-Ghazali affirms that genuine spiritual truth possesses a universal quality capable of fostering cooperation across different cultures and belief systems. At the same time, it is expansive and nuanced enough to accommodate varied spiritual expressions suited to the unique circumstances and capacities of different communities and individuals. He supports social systems that uphold the rights of diverse groups to pursue their own spiritual paths, provided these are aligned with universal standards of justice, ethical behavior, and mutual respect. Such systems make it possible for pluralistic societies to thrive in peace and collaboration. Al-Ghazali does not advocate for a forced uniformity that suppresses valuable distinctions, nor for a disunity that undermines common purpose. Rather, he envisions a cohesive unity, one that honors both the diversity and the shared spiritual core of humanity. Part 15. The Eternal Wisdom. Al-Ghazali's philosophical journey does not culminate in a single doctrine or isolated concept. Rather, it reaches its peak in his profound demonstration that life's most essential inquiries, those concerning knowledge, being, morality, and purpose, require an integrated framework. This approach grants equal significance to disciplined intellectual analysis and the deep revelations of authentic spiritual insight. What distinguishes Al-Ghazali's legacy is his remarkable ability to weave together these seemingly divergent paths. Instead of setting reason and spirituality at odds, he shows how they can operate in mutual reinforcement. His vision transcends the limits of rationalism without discarding its valuable contributions, creating a more expansive and inclusive pursuit of truth. He makes it clear that rational thought and logical analysis are indispensable tools in preparing the mind for deeper understanding. These faculties sharpen perception, foster critical inquiry, and lay the groundwork for exploration. Yet, Al-Ghazali underscores that reason by itself cannot pierce the ultimate layers of reality, nor can it satisfy the soul's deepest yearning for meaning and transformation. By uniting intellect with spiritual experience, Al-Ghazali charts a course to insights unattainable by either method alone. This synthesis requires what he calls intellectual humility, a recognition that human reasoning, no matter how refined, is inherently limited and cannot claim total mastery over truth. Such humility does not advocate for abandoning logic or accepting irrationality. Instead, it invites openness to dimensions of understanding that transcend analytical reasoning while still aligning with it. The truly humble thinker uses reason to its fullest extent, yet remains aware that truth ultimately surpasses the mind's finite reach. At the same time, Al-Ghazali avoids the pitfalls of purely personal spirituality, even as he emphasizes its importance. He demonstrates that genuine spiritual awakening fosters not only inner peace, but also outward compassion, moral clarity, and a deeper sense of responsibility to others. Through sincere spiritual discipline, individuals become more attuned to the needs of their families, communities, and society as a whole. This heightened sensitivity enhances their capacity to serve rather than isolating them from the world. Conversely, participating in social responsibility becomes a sacred practice in itself, enriching one's spiritual life through active engagement. Al-Ghazali's understanding of the interplay between the material world and the eternal realm offers profound solace to one of humanity's most persistent anxieties, the fear that human life may be meaningless in the vast, indifferent cosmos. He affirms that despite its temporal nature, human consciousness can partake in the eternal through the search for wisdom, the power of love, and acts of service that link finite lives to infinite purpose. This connection does not erase life's suffering or difficulties, but it grants them meaning. It provides the strength to endure hardship and the inspiration to hold on to hope, even in the face of overwhelming adversity. The practical relevance of Al-Ghazali's thought extends far beyond personal contemplation. His philosophy offers a blueprint for integrating ethical and spiritual values into every domain of life. It suggests educational systems that cultivate both intellectual rigor and spiritual depth, economic models that honor human dignity above profit, and political frameworks that combine justice with moral and spiritual development. His teachings also illuminate how families and communities might be structured to encourage both individual transformation and collective harmony. Yet, his insights are not rigid prescriptions. Al-Ghazali does not present a one-size-fits-all formula. Instead, he provides flexible principles and adaptable methodologies designed to be applied thoughtfully across varying cultural and historical contexts while remaining faithful to universal truths. In his skillful reconciliation of continuity with change, Al-Ghazali reveals a deeper wisdom, that genuine spiritual principles are simultaneously timeless and responsive. They retain their essence across the ages, yet they invite new forms of expression as human circumstances evolve. This enduring architecture of human awareness, the essential foundations of spiritual development, along with the fundamental ideals of justice and morality, remain consistent across all periods and cultures. Yet, the ways in which these values are interpreted and practiced must be continually reimagined in light of humanity's evolving awareness, changing social dynamics, and the emergence of new trials and possibilities. The goal is not to rigidly cling to outdated expressions of these truths, but to rediscover and apply enduring principles in ways that meaningfully address present-day realities and genuinely promote human flourishing. A living tradition requires thoughtful interaction with both the wisdom of the past and the insights of the present, allowing for a response to today's challenges that is both grounded and adaptable. Al-Ghazali stands as a compelling example of someone who maintained a firm commitment to core spiritual and ethical truths while remaining open to advances in areas like psychology, social organization, and the natural sciences. His ability to weave together diverse streams of knowledge offers a powerful framework for addressing the complex issues of our time, issues that demand not only technical proficiency, but also a deep comprehension of human motivation and ultimate purpose. What lends Al-Ghazali's philosophical contribution such lasting significance is his demonstration that the human quest for truth, meaning, and fulfillment is both legitimate and attainable. He advocated for an integrative approach, one that embraces intellectual reasoning, emotional depth, and spiritual insight, as essential to uncovering and living in accordance with deeper truths. In both his life and his writings, Al-Ghazali asserts that it is possible for individuals to reach a state of genuine certainty about life's most profound questions, to experience spiritual contentment, and to dedicate themselves to causes that transcend self-interest. However, this path requires a sincere commitment to seeking truth, steady engagement in spiritual discipline, and a humble dependence on divine grace, practices that many neglect due to their difficulty or the fear of uncertain outcomes. His enduring relevance stems from his focus on universal aspects of the human condition, concerns that resonate across generations, while also speaking directly to the particular struggles of contemporary individuals and societies. The problems he examined, such as harmonizing faith with reason, nurturing personal transformation, and balancing temporal duties with eternal purpose, remain just as urgent today as they were in his era. Al-Ghazali's responses to these timeless dilemmas continue to have impact not because they conform to the transient values of any specific age, but because they are rooted in a profound understanding of human nature and the fabric of existence. His journey from skepticism and intellectual inquiry to spiritual clarity and practical wisdom offers a roadmap that remains open to anyone willing to pursue it with seriousness, guidance, and heartfelt commitment. His story affirms that while the pursuit of integrated knowledge and spiritual depth is demanding and often entails personal sacrifice, it ultimately leads to a richness of insight, tranquility, and purposeful living that more than justifies the effort. The luminous legacy of truth he uncovered still speaks with clarity and power, just as it did centuries ago, guiding and inspiring those who earnestly seek answers to life's deepest questions.